Countdown in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. From the top rope, and the Great American Bash, I bid you all good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be in this great land of ours, or around the world. Welcome to the $55 million studio. I'm the Pro Wrestle Machine. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. September 21, 1998 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. Flair returns to WCW. Huge Raw, tons more. By Observer staff. The reason Ric Flair's return to World Championship Wrestling on the September 14 Nitro in Greenville, South Carolina exceeded everyone's imagination is because there was nothing ever in wrestling to compare it with. If there was ever any one moment that firmly established who the greatest performer of modern time, if not all time was, it was not the huge initial pop, but when the deafening roar wouldn't stop. He may not be the greatest athlete who ever stepped in the ring, although he is a great athlete. He may not be the greatest drawing card, although he is a great drawing card. He may not have been in the greatest match of all time, although he probably was in more great ones than whoever numbers 2, 3 and 4 on the list are combined. He may not be the all-time greatest interview, although he very well might be, but at his motivated best, nobody can touch him. And for people who admit to Flair as being a great worker, but not a superstar in the industry on the level of others who had more mainstream notoriety, or that he's past the point due to age of being marketed as a top star, well, the earthquake-sounding reverberations heard round the country on September 14 must have been quite a jolt of reality. Flair had a moment reserved for few athletes in history, none of whom are wrestlers, not even Antonio Inoki or El Santo, the modern equivalent of the day when a dying Lou Gehrig came to Yankee Stadium and talked about being the luckiest man alive. And in a business that lives for the moment and forgets history, this was such an emotional scene that it may be remembered for longer than the requisite 1 week. But whatever happens next will be anticlimactic. It almost didn't happen, as there was a dispute that came up on either Friday or early Saturday where Flair wasn't going to appear. WCW was hoping to still rectify everything for Flair to debut next week in Boston, but everything was back in place by Sunday morning. Flair was broken down in tears by the incredible reaction and had blood coming out of his mouth from biting his lip or tongue. This week's version of the biggest Monday night in history was among the best. WWF, anxious to get back in the game after 2 weeks off, presented a pay-per-view caliber lineup headlined by the first-ever Steve Austin vs. Ken Shamrock match, multiple turns of Undertaker to full-fledged heel, Rocky Maivia to babyface, and Mankind, who was pretty much already there, to full-fledged babyface, a bare-breasted woman, eltery, men beating up women, women beating up men, women ripping the clothes off women, sledgehammers and vampires along with the greatest soap opera in sports. WCW presented the greatest pop in wrestling television for Flair, the first ever televised Bill Goldberg vs. Sting main event that beat Austin vs. Shamrock in the ratings, and a 4-star match that figured to get whipped in the ratings by the Superstar Star Power on the other channel, but didn't, making Billy Kidman a star in one night with his Cruiserweight title win over Juventud Guerrera. Comparing the quality of the two shows is difficult because Raw was a more consistent and better balanced show, but Nitro had the best match of the evening and by far the best segment of the evening. Nitro was going to win almost no matter what because of both Flair's return and the natural ground Raw was going to have to make up from being preempted for 2 weeks because of tennis. The half-point victory certainly can't be seen as a loss for WCW, but realistically it can't be considered a loss for WWF either, even if the numbers say otherwise. Nitro wound up with a 4.54 rating, 4.84 first hour, 3.99 seconds hour, 4.79 third hour, and 6.9 share. Raw did a 3.99 rating, 3.89 first hour, 4.09 seconds hour, and 6.0 share. The Washington Redskins vs. San Francisco 49ers Monday Night Football game did a 12.7 rating in competition, which is well below the 14.9 that MNF averaged last season. These numbers with such strong shows seems to indicate the record-breaking ratings from a few weeks back are a thing of the past, competing with first-run network programming in football, but also that this season wrestling is going to bite a sizable chunk out of the NFL ratings. The quarter hours also seem to indicate each side has a core audience of about a 3.6 each, and the remaining 1.3 to 2.0 ratings points, or basically 1 million to 1.5 million homes, are swing votes that switch based on who was the most intriguing product during that quarter hour. So even with WWF's disadvantage from the preemptions in previous weeks, it was able to win 3 of the 9 segments. The biggest gap of the regular 2-hour show was when WCW trotted out the re-emergence of the Four Horsemen, which did a 5.44 rating, while Raw presented Mark Henry's handicap match against China and X-Pac and the evening grown clothes stripping brawl with Sable vs. Jacqueline, which wound up with Jacqueline breasts being exposed, which showed again on the replay, and did a 3.79 rating, although actually the gap was greater in WCW's favor during the overrun with the world title matches competing. It was the third consecutive WCW television show where the Arn Anderson segment was the highest rated quarter hour of the show. In the head-to-head title matches you had a very interesting situation. The ring introductions and first 6 minutes of Steve Austin vs. Ken Shamrock drew the WWF's peak rating of the night with a 4.87. Nitro during that same period was airing the ring entrances for Bill Goldberg and Sting, which dropped to a 4.26, which is an amazing turnover since it was coming off the 5.44 for the Flair segment. And this shows the amount of channel switching that goes on in the overrun period, which saw the last 6 minutes of Austin Shamrock and the post-match run-ins. Raw fell to a 4.06 while Nitro, with the actual Goldberg-Sting match and run-ins, did a 6.07. The other comparisons were Raw winning the first segment 3.9 McMahon, Austin, Kane, Undertaker angle to 3.7, Guerrero vs. Kidman, which morally has to be considered a victory for Nitro. Nitro took the second quarter 4.1, Guerrero vs. Kidman finish and Bulldog vs. Barbarian, to 3.6, Jarrett vs. Road Dogg, beginning of Maivia vs. Kane. Raw came back with a 4.1 Maivia vs. Kane finish, Undertaker Mankind Challenge and Runnels Venus angle, to 3.8 Hogan Warrior angle, which also confirms just what everyone thought about how much legs Warrior was going to have, as his segments are already losing to a ratings killer like Val Venus and Dustin Runnels. And then Nitro reversed things again with a 4.3 Scott Steiner handicap match and Giant vs. Meng, to 4.0 Helmsley vs. Hart. The second hour opened with a close call with Nitro doing a 4.03, Scott Hall Drunken Stupor Survey Time interview, to 3.98, Undertaker vs. Mankind, then Nitro building to a 4.8, Hall vs. Luger and beginning of Horseman interview to 3.7, Edge vs. Gangrel, before the big gap in Nitro's favor with the Horsemen against the women. There is little doubt that the closing moments of the Bret Hart vs. Shawn Michaels match on November 9, 1997 in Montreal will go down from a historical standpoint as the most noteworthy finish to a pro wrestling match in the modern wrestling era. It's a finish that literally changed the business to its current dual reality and set up this era's version of the angle everyone does with the heel owner. While Eric Bischoff played the role first, it was Vince McMahon's portrayal of the role, which evolved from the real-life reaction to him from his role in this match, that set up the amazing success of the World Wrestling Federation and some would argue pro wrestling in general this year, and made promotions around the world, both big and small, copy the idea. The arguments surrounding the finish of that match became a wrestling version of Bill Clinton and Kenneth Starr and were debated hotly for months, often based on political affiliation rather than the more difficult and thought-provoking honest addressing of the real issues. Who was right? Who was wrong? Who was in on double-crossing Hart? Or was it all a ruse by McMahon and Hart to begin with and just the most well-executed wrestling angle of all time? And just when you thought everything that could possibly be said about the subject had been said, and wrestling had moved on to another contrived soap opera, it's about to come back with the soon-to-be-released movie, Hitman Hart, Wrestling with Shadows. The documentary on the Survivor Series match, which will open on October 19th at the Sheffield, England Film Festival, the biggest documentary film festival in the country, will precede eventual release dates around the world. It is expected to air before the end of the year on network television in Canada, and on cable, most likely the ON channel, in the United States. It will be released on video late next month, actually before its television debut. For more information on getting the movie you can either call 1-800-900-6952 or check out the website at www.berthartvideo.com. The movie, produced by Paul J., Sally Blake, and David Ostreicher itself, is a very honest look at both its star and of the profession. Both the inside nature and honesty in covering that of the film makes it easily not only the most accurate but also the best wrestling movie ever produced to this point in time. It's a movie with many different messages, both about the reality and phoniness of the profession. The main theme is the conflict and end result of what happened in Montreal, somewhat simplified for the general audience. The movie storyline is very much patterned after the November 17th Observer issue, starting with Hart's conflict of deciding between the two offers, continues with his being asked to turn heel, the Canada vs. USA feud, McMahon wanting to redo his contract, the tension leading up to and in the aftermath of making his decision to join WCW, and ending with the already legendary match. McMahon will come off to the general audience as the villain in the movie, the man who expected total loyalty from his employees because he made them stars, but feeling he owed them little or none in return. But this movie will not convince McMahon's defenders to change their belief, as his lying to Hart about the finish will be defended using the same logic, or lack thereof, of people who insist that Bill Clinton either really didn't lie under oath, or that because of the circumstances, the lie wasn't really a lie or the circumstances dictated it was okay to lie. Hart himself has written that the movie will vindicate him, but the reality is Hart was long ago vindicated as far as who was the one who was honest in their version of the story in the aftermath. But to people where honesty is not the crux of the issue, the movie gives McMahon's defenders a strong enough sense that Hart strongly refused to do the job and McMahon had no choice, and the creative control issue, which is really the crux of the Hart argument and where the traditions of the promoter having final word is somewhat nullified in this instance, can be rationalized away as easily as Clinton defenders rationalize that lying under oath about sex isn't perjury, or to extreme defenders, even a lie. For that matter, it also won't convince those who believe it was all a ruse to begin with. It wasn't, but that's another story that's far more complicated to go into here and has been largely beaten to death, and I'm not sure if I saw the movie and knowing what I know about wrestling, didn't know better about this specific subject, I wouldn't come to that conclusion either, to change that belief. The basic theme has become well known to wrestling fans. Hart, as a free agent, spurned a more lucrative offer from Turner Broadcasting out of loyalty to McMahon, who he considered as almost a second father in some ways, and the World Wrestling Federation, which made him a bigger star than he ever imagined he'd become, and signed an unprecedented 20-year contract with the WWF. Much of the movie covers the major WWF storyline of 1997, the Canada vs. USA War, much of which was Hart's ideas because of his attempt to remain a babyface in Canada and cling on to his role as a Canadian national hero, while playing new top babyface Steve Austin's main rival in the United States. What happens from there has been perhaps the most analyzed story in pro wrestling history. McMahon's attempt to break the contract only 1 year in, Hart's making the deal with Eric Bischoff while still holding the WWF title, and all the forces of conflict that resulted in what eventually happened in the match. The movie covers those issues fairly, but not in exhaustive detail. The issues are simplified as compared to the written versions covered here. For example, it covers McMahon's conversation with Hart on September 22 in Madison Square Garden, where he claimed due to the company being in financial peril, that he couldn't afford Hart's $1.5 million per year contract and suggested he open negotiations with WCW. However, it doesn't cover previous talks which had gone back for months with McMahon trying to backload the contract, to where the weekly $30,000 salary would be cut back greatly, and in exchange, McMahon promised to increase Hart's contracted deal at the back end so he'd end up with the same money, which Hart turned down. Nor does it go into detail how just a few weeks later, McMahon claimed to Hart that the company's financial situation had turned around, which is from all sources an accurate assessment of company finances at the time, largely stemming from the company's upswing in business at the time combined with raising the price of the in-your-house pay-per-view shows from $19.95 to $29.95, and he now could afford Hart's deal. But by this time Hart recognized that Austin was the top babyface and Shawn Michaels was the top heel, and his character was caught in almost a tweener purgatory, and McMahon's future plans for him were more along the lines of putting both of them over. The ghost of Brian Pillman ends up being a dangling participle in the movie. In the early footage, you see Pillman as part of the Hart Foundation, and with the exception of Brett, as the most camera-friendly part. And in the later scenes, he's just not there, with no explanation given. This was an editing decision with the feeling that the Pillman story being explained would overpower everything else in the movie, and to do it justice would take far too much time. The conflict with Michaels, which is actually a key to how everything went down, because Michaels insisted many times that he was unwilling to put Hart over, which led to Hart refusing to put Michaels over in Montreal, with their legitimate backstage fight and personal problems were never examined so as not to create another strong villain in the story. Nor was the irony of both Austin and Michaels each refusing to do jobs for Rocky Maivia and Owen Hart for the IC and European titles respectively weeks later, and the WWF creating clever storylines for them to drop the title without actually losing, showing the strong emphasis placed on doing jobs and dropping titles when asked was only a major issue to McMahon when convenient to become a major issue. And it was interesting to watch as the afternoon of SummerSlam where Hart was going to win the title, where he realized that it was a setup for Michaels to take his spot, and with the knowledge of all the problems between the two, yet at around the same time, Michaels and Bret Son Blade were horsing around like big brother and little brother in the empty Meadowlands, which was just another example of the weird camaraderie of surface friendships that end with backstabbing in the profession. You get the vivid impression Hart doesn't like Michaels, and even more than Michaels doesn't like Hart. But that somehow in this strange world the two bring out the best in each other. But finally, In a conversation in Detroit the day before Montreal, Hart recognized it was McMahon's orchestrating it and him realizing his own internal conflicts and contradictions of McMahon and Michaels wanting him to say inside things about Michaels while at the same time, he didn't want Michaels saying those same things about him and his family. The actual finish in Montreal went back and forth several times, including at one point just a few days before the match McMahon's suggestion that Hart win cleanly, which Michaels balked at. Although the movie examining that aspect of the regularly changing finish over that past week that closely would have only confused the big picture. But the basic story, which is accurate its portrayal, is that McMahon wanted Hart to lose. Hart said to him that he would just as soon blow my brains out, and that Hart had previously negotiated creative control over the last 30 days, which meant any finish had to be agreed on by both sides. Almost as interesting as the movie itself are the circumstances that surrounded it. What it started out as and wound up being were two completely different things. High Road Productions of Toronto in early 1996 came up with the idea of doing a documentary on Hart, a famous Canadian pro wrestler with a unique family who was known worldwide as the top star of the WWF. The movie nearly didn't get off the ground since Hart himself wanted to try acting and hadn't fully decided whether or not to even return to wrestling after dropping the title to Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania. When he decided he would return, he hadn't decided which company he would return with. When he signed with the WWF, and it was clear at the time the plans were for him to be the top star in the company, a contract was signed between High Road and the WWF in late 1996. At this point the thought process was he'd be a long-term world champion by the time the movie came out. The agreement signed was that the WWF would provide High Road with any footage they requested, and at the same time High Road would have full access to Hart into all WWF events to do a completely straight documentary. About the only side deal was that neither Austin nor Undertaker could be shown backstage or out of the ring being out of character or socializing with the other wrestlers. High Road on its own protected other wrestlers who spoke out vehemently in the dressing room after the match in Montreal that are current WWF headliners that would have probably strengthened the story but would have potentially damaged the careers of those headliners by so publicly speaking out against the boss's decision. No doubt at that time the contract was signed, WWF felt a positive documentary on Hart would only strengthen and humanize him as their top babyface star, and the idea of protecting secrets of the business was no big deal, but even at this point there was a deal to protect the character of Austin and Undertaker. The production crew followed Hart around for several months to the point they became closer with him than most of the wrestlers, and largely had finished filming the movie when Hart captured the title from Undertaker due to Michaels' interference on August 3rd at SummerSlam. Of course, what happened after SummerSlam turned into a far more noteworthy story, but they did not attend any shows after the title switch, thought they had finished shooting wrestling footage, and instead were mainly filming segments and gathering footage from and with the family until literally days before Montreal when everything was going down. The amount of footage backstage in Montreal is amazing, to the point one would think it was an angle just because so much winds up being played before the cameras, particularly when the movie contains excerpts of the actual private conversations between McMahon and Hart where McMahon basically agrees to do a run-in DQ finish. The actual unedited version of the tape, which would take far too much time for the movie, is far more illuminating because it was a lot clearer how everything was going down. Perhaps most importantly, McMahon never, as he had maintained, asked Hart to lose or brought up any other ideas for a finish other than a run-in. From McMahon's voice, and this could be reading too much into it, but it seemed obvious, it sounded as if he had already decided what he was doing. Which obviously he had, but did feel bad about it as there was a certain sadness in his voice and reactions, as he was lying to a guy who had been such a great performer for him for more than 13 years. It also had a brief excerpt from the conversation between Hart and Pat Patterson that set up a spot which resulted in the double cross. In actuality, Hart was wired the entire day in Montreal, both because there was a lot of tension going in and it wasn't as if everyone involved didn't smell the possibility of a rat. Everyone close to him discussed it with him, and he was looking to gather his own evidence in case things would wind up in court over a breach of contract since McMahon had already threatened him with legal action in the days leading up to the match. Exactly when McMahon found out about the existence of the tape isn't known, as it was kept a well-guarded secret literally until the past week or so when McMahon himself was sent a copy of the film. By Canadian criminal codes, if at least one member of a conversation knows it is being taped, it is legal to use the tape. While Hart's punch of McMahon is not on tape as Brett asked them to leave, McMahon going into Hart's locker room, although this was actually quite a while after the match as he had locked himself in his office for a long time, and coming out limping after injuring his ankle after losing balance taking the shot, airs along with Hart, who does have small marks on his face after the fight that he didn't have after the match with Michaels. This appears to ruin McMahon's free shot assertion of the fight. After the incident has Hart sheepishly saying, "Vince's head ran into my fist." Although Titan Sports was not aware that High Road had the actual conversations Hart had with Patterson and McMahon on tape, after Montreal, with Hart having left the company and the bitterness between the two sides, which still exists greatly today, many in the WWF were gloating this past weekend, noting that the September 11th house show in Calgary drew a bigger crowd than Bret had ever drawn in his home city. While Hart's career hasn't exactly taken an upward turn, combined with the fact their business in Canada has gotten much stronger this year, they ceased cooperating with the movie, which also nearly wound up in court. Despite the contract, WWF refused to cooperate in a movie that they assumed, correctly, would be largely favorable to Hart, who by this point was hated by the company, and paint an unflattering portrait of McMahon. Where everything came down was about 1 month ago, when WCW was ready to make a deal to purchase the premiere rights to the movie, with the plan to air it on pay-per-view first and on either TNT or TBS sometime in the future. By this point, two things had changed. First, Titan was no longer as leery about the movie's potential honest portrayal of what went down in Montreal and of McMahon, as it was the first 2 months after Survivor Series, before the decision was made to use McMahon so strongly in his current role, which was its main problem in refusing to cooperate, because McMahon had used Montreal as the springboard for his very successful heel character and the current monstrous business, and this movie only plays into the current role. Second, the last thing Titan wanted was a movie about the WWF, and with WWF characters airing on a pay-per-view promoted by WCW and on Turner stations, and in order for both sides to avoid legal proceedings because High Road believed WWF had breached its contract by not providing all footage requested, WWF agreed to provide footage and sign all the needed release forms which hadn't been signed, in exchange for High Road agreeing that the movie can't air on TBS, TNT, or as a pay-per-view promoted by WCW. While the focal point of the movie is Hart, and to those who don't really understand the inner workings of wrestling, he comes across as the good guy in the movie even as he's playing bad guy wrestler in much of the wrestling footage, in that he refused to take a dive despite pressure from the evil promoter. To wrestling fans, they'll get a different message, since taking a dive and wrestling are one and the same. If you understand wrestling, you'll get a fair portrayal of Hart, both his positives and negatives. A very successful wrestler who takes wrestling and his character awfully serious, many would say too serious. An admittedly less than perfect husband from a very unique family where, to the consternation of his mother who never liked wrestling and never could like wrestling, she saw all 8 of her sons become wrestlers, and all 4 of her daughters marry wrestlers. A man with a strong desire to be able to logically explain things so in the end he doesn't disappoint his true fans, or maybe more importantly, disappoint himself. But more importantly, Hart comes across as a 40-year-old star, with younger and more flamboyant wrestlers, Michaels in particular, nipping on his heels, in a rapidly changing business that revolves around television ratings, and the new direction of anything but wholesome family entertainment is one that he was having a hard time coming to grips with. To me, the stars of the movie were the women in the Hart family who tried to be normal while being linked with and being engulfed in the quicksand of a world that simply isn't normal. Helen Hart, thrust into a business she can't get out of no matter how badly she wanted to be. The daughters, teased into tears by classmates as children. And the real heroic figure of the movie, ironically enough, was Bret's wife Julie, raising 4 kids largely on her own while her husband is touring the world playing superhero, waiting 18 years for him to come home and for them to lead what she believes is a real life, and obviously being impatient for this to happen. I think it's time to be normal. More impressively, she comes across as the only one in the movie who at every turn sees through all the phoniness of not only McMahon but the people who work in the profession, right up until just before the match when Bret tells her it's okay, it's a disqualification, and she responds, "I don't believe it." She was in the most telling scenes about the movie, coming to Montreal with everyone talking, like in the last day of a job, about how sorry they were things were doing down this way and getting together and keeping in touch when she almost mockingly saw through the phoniness of it, and her lashing out at Hunter Hearst Helmsley minutes after the match in front of a stunned group of wrestlers, who were embarrassed into silence, and not believing for a second when he swore to God and protested that he had no idea beforehand about what had just happened. And you come across with strange emotions regarding Bret's father Stu. This apparently gentle old man and local wrestling legend on the outside, who grew up in a foster home and found his salvation by becoming one of the toughest men in the world, is contradicted by the sadistic side of him, who after being tortured himself learning submission wrestling, got off on being a bully and ended up being known worldwide for torturing anyone foolish enough to step into the famed dungeon, including haunting sounds of the famed audio tapes of men literally screaming for their lives downstairs while the rest of the family could hear the sounds upstairs, and they were being twisted into God only knows what positions. Yet Stu, who spent his life in and around wrestling, and had to cope with life without what he knew best when he sold his wrestling territory, still came across as a sympathetic father who couldn't figure out why McMahon would want to lose such an employee, who had done such a good job for him for so many years. The movie, without saying so, almost unwittingly gives some answers as to why things really happened and raises other issues. In hindsight, why McMahon chose to do what he did is still something only he knows, and he has been less than honest in many versions as to what went down, so it would hard to believe what he said on the subject at this point, since all his original excuses about Hart refusing to ever drop the title or do business in their afternoon conversation, when Hart never refused anything brought up in that conversation, or his showing up on Nitro in Memphis the next day with his title belts, simply fell apart as more came out. Perhaps he was afraid Hart wouldn't lose the title in the ring, although Hart never refused that request, not trusting him. Let's face it, McMahon knew the situation well enough to know that Hart shouldn't trust him, so the counter would be that he shouldn't trust Hart either. Hart's suggestion to simply vacate the title on TV the next day, which McMahon agreed to without an argument, certainly would play into those fears, as no doubt McMahon was as wary, if not more so, of a potential double-cross as Hart was. Perhaps he wanted to punish Hart for being so critical to the mainstream media about the new direction of the WWF, as McMahon had already lashed back at Hart both about his complaints about the new direction and trying to portray it, and I do believe McMahon sincerely believes this, that at the core Hart made a money decision. The conclusion after watching the movie that I came to was that while all the other factors probably contributed, McMahon, and actually Hart, together created a patriotic Canadian hero in a market that WWF basically owned. His going to WCW could open up competition in that market, and a time when McMahon was already losing in competition to WCW in its home country. McMahon probably felt he had to have Hart lose in Canada for the same reasons, to weaken the character so he wouldn't be as strong in Canada when he went into WCW, and they opened up competition in what has proven to be for some 15 years a lucrative market for the WWF, that Hart was dead set against losing for. In the end, and one has to consider my own frame of reference, both good and bad, from someone who not only had a tiny role in the movie, and didn't just read the book on the subject, but practically wrote it. This was not just a good wrestling movie or an honest portrayal of both its subject and the profession in general, including some gripping footage of a match years ago, when Hart ruptured his sternum. It was a good movie, period. And more important than who screwed who in Montreal, is the end result of seeing the movie. Beneath all the veneers, pro wrestling is far more real, and more phony, than most people can imagine. This was certainly the week for pro wrestlers being placed under arrest. In the potentially most damaging case, Taz, Pete Senerka, was arrested on September 12 in Pittsburgh before the ECW show that night on charges of indecent exposure and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. The Moon Township Police Department refused to release details of the case because the victim was 15 years old. What is believed to have happened is that Senerka, 30, went to a tanning salon near the airport in Pittsburgh at about noon. According to what is believed, the girl in question, who worked at the salon as a receptionist, claimed that Senerka invited her into the room and asked her to rub oil on him, and he asked to rub oil on her. He allegedly asked her to take off her shirt, and when she did, he allegedly exposed himself to her. At about 12:30 p.m., after he had left, she called the police, who immediately went to the district attorney to issue a bench warrant because Senerka would be leaving town that evening, and arrested him later that afternoon and took him to a holding cell until he was released on bail on Monday morning. A preliminary hearing is expected to take place next week. Those in wrestling who know Senerka well were pretty much in disbelief because he has something of a reputation for staying away from women. The Giant Paul White, 27, was arraigned September 9 in Nassau and released later that day on his own recognizance on third-degree assault charges stemming from his punching and breaking the jaw of Robert Sawyer Jr., 29, at the Marriott Hotel in Uniondale after the June 15 Nitro show. The incident was well known and reported on at the time it took place, with many witnesses. Sawyer, who was estimated by witnesses as being about 6'5", was alleged to have started trouble first with Kevin Nash, who simply walked away from the problem. He then started with the Giant and began provoking him until Giant retaliated by punching him in the face and sending him scurrying. In a very funny line regarding this incident in Newsday, it said that the police took more than 2 months to get White to turn himself in because authorities had to determine that he was the man who hit Sawyer. Actually, the belief is that White knew he needed to clear up the problem to avoid being arrested when WCW returned to the area for the Nitro on November 9 at the Nassau Coliseum. Jim Neidhart, 43, was arrested on September 7 after the Nitro in Pensacola, Florida, and charged with writing a bad check of $174.20 to a Publix supermarket in 1996. Neidhart was questioned at about 4 a.m. when he was in his car, and the officer ran a computer check. It showed he was wanted in Lutz, Florida, near his former home of Tampa, for writing a bad check. He was released the next morning. Matt Osborne, 41, was arrested and taken to jail on September 8 in Elwood City, Pennsylvania on an outstanding warrant from 1995 on charges of institutional vandalism, harassment, criminal mischief, public drunkenness, trespassing, and disorderly conduct. Osborne, who was wrestling in the area at that time as Doink the Clown and now lives in Portland, Oregon, was taken in when police received a tip he was back in the area. Area police had actually believed internet rumors that Osborne had died, but since they had never received proof of his death, they never removed his name as being a fugitive on those charges. Whether Fall Brawl set a new standard for awful in pay-per-view is a debatable issue. What isn't debatable is that it was near the top of any list of the worst pay-per-view wrestling shows ever. With the exception of a very good Raven vs. Saturn match, a funny comedy spot with Chris Jericho and a fake Bill Goldberg, although fans live hated it because the setup implied Goldberg would appear and he didn't, and the good news announcement by Tony Schiavone that doctors believed they were able to get all the cancerous cells out of Jim Duggan's body in the operation 3 days earlier. There was nothing of any value whatsoever during the 3 hours. The show on September 13th at the Lawrence Stroll Coliseum in Winston-Salem drew a sellout 11,528 paying $218,780 and another $85,968 in merchandise. It featured a main event so bad that it was even worse than people's imaginations would have been of the Jay Leno match going in. With the possible exception of the triple-decker cage match a few years back on an uncensored and perhaps some Andre the Giant matches toward the end of his career, this may have been the worst pay-per-view main event of all time. About 20 minutes of bad wrestling made worse by a finish that simply defied description. Unlike previous WCW shows with bad main events, this didn't have anything on the undercard with the exception of the Raven match that remotely saved it, and featured 4 other matches that would have won worst match on any normal bad pay-per-view show. 1. Davey Boy Smith, David Smith, and Jim Neidhart beat Alex Wright and Disco Inferno Glenn Gilberti in 11:03. Disco and Alex weren't that bad. Wright was actually good by himself, but not good enough to carry anyone. Their opponent seemed to be somewhere else. There were so many mistimed spots it wasn't funny. It went too long and finally ended when Smith pinned Inferno after a power slam, although it took him 3 tries to actually get Inferno up. 1/4 of 1 star. 2. Chris Jericho, Chris Irvine, defeated a fake Bill Goldberg in 1:15. It was all comedy. First Jericho was walking around lost backstage trying to get to the ring. Then Goldberg's music played and a guy who looked to be about 5'2" came out, who I believe is either a Georgia indie wrestler who uses the name CC DeVellion or sometimes Jobber Johnny Attitude, who I believe was the most likely of the two, since it said he just recently got his head shaved and got a Goldberg tattoo on his arm. I believe DeVellion actually just a few weeks ago was at a Titan TV taping looking to play the role of a fake Steve Austin. He does a total Austin gimmick as comedy on indie shows. He did all the Goldberg mannerisms and Jericho even sold the spear, before beating him with a lion tamer. The crowd felt ripped off since before the first match they made the big announcement to the live crowd of a Jericho vs. Goldberg match added to the show. They really needed to have the real Goldberg do a run-in after the match so at least fans would see Goldberg live. Actually, this was one of the best parts of the show, but some didn't like it because it was exactly like a gimmick done just 2 months ago with Rey Mysterio Jr. 1/2 of 1 star. 3. Ernest Miller pinned Norman Smiley in 5:04 after a kick that totally missed, coming on the heels of already blowing the finish once with a feliner off the ropes that also missed, and they were wise enough not to use as a finish. Nobody cares about Miller and these two worked together poorly. -1 star. 4. Rick Steiner, Rob Reach Steiner, went to a no contest with Scott Reach Steiner, in 5:30. They actually started with about 1 minute of good brawling. Rick then rammed Marcus Bagwell, who kept interfering, into the turnbuckles and Bagwell collapsed as if he'd re-injured his neck. The poor announcers had to sell it even though nobody in the crowd was buying it. They then had to do this long angle of the match ending, everyone acting concerned and Bagwell being immobilized and put on a stretcher and taken to the ambulance. It was torture because the crowd was booing rather than acting concerned. Since nobody bought it, nobody cared or was surprised when Scott and Bagwell jumped out of the ambulance and attacked Rick. -1 star. 5. Juventud Guerrera and Anibal Gonzalez retained the WCW Cruiserweight title beating Silver King, Cesar Gonzalez, in 8:36. This wasn't bad, although it was disappointing considering the level of competitors involved. The problem with the match at the outset was how evident it is that Silver King is no cruiserweight, except that all Mexicans, regardless of size, are cruiserweights in WCW. Since Silver King has no credibility, the fans were chanting boring early. Silver King did his Silver King plancha. Guerrera totally botched up a Toyota roll. There was a period in the middle where the two guys were on different pages. They did recover and actually built well to the finish, including Guerrera doing a reverse Franken Toyota which the announcers acted as if had never been seen before, although Guerrera has done it previously in WCW but I don't believe ever on pay-per-view, and tore the house down. After a first attempted Hoovy driver, King turned it into a small package. He then missed a double springboard quebrada, but Hoovy came back with a really weak Hoovy driver as the setup for the 450. Hoovy was wearing Sweet Surrender on his trunks which I'm told is some kind of a gay deal which someone told him to wear as a practical joke. 2 stars. 6. Perry Saturn Satullo beat Raven, Scott Levy, in 1404. The steps were if Raven won, then Saturn would have to rejoin the flock. If Saturn won, the flock would disband. They also added a stip that Canyon would be handcuffed to the ring post, which made plenty of sense since Lodi was also at ringside interfered constantly. The first half of the match wasn't that good but it picked up due to the well-timed booking of the outside interference, as opposed to the usual overbooking of the interference to where it numbs the crowd. Saturn used a splash off the top for a near fall and Raven took a bump off the apron onto the guardrail from the punch, but it was a delayed bump that looked really bad. Saturn even did a tope onto Raven and the flock. Lodi threw Saturn off the apron and he crashed onto the guardrail. Lodi held up a sign that said, "Bill, did you inhale?" which got a reaction which was the only reaction the match was getting at this point. They were on a different page when Raven went to clothesline Saturn so it looked bad. Raven did the drop toe hold on the chair spot. Riggs, Horace Boulder and Sick Boy showed up, bring out a table and setting it up which made the idea that Canyon was handcuffed because they didn't want outside interference even more ludicrous. They set up a spot where Saturn was down and Kidman was on the top rope, theoretically to give the 7-year itch, which probably shouldn't be called that anymore since Kidman no longer itches, to Saturn, but instead he delivered a missile dropkick to Raven and ran into the crowd which got a good pop. Saturn hit the Death Valley driver but Raven kicked out which was a real good false finish. From that point on, the match was real good. Saturn hit a T-bone and belly-to-belly suplex and a springboard leg drop for a near fall. He delivered a Hoovy driver, a lot better than Hoovy did earlier, for another near fall. He locked on the rings of Saturn but Lodi broke it up. He hit Raven low and kicked Lodi low before a ref bump on Mickey J near Canyon. Naturally Canyon got the key from the ref and unlocked himself, delivered the flatliner to Saturn and put Raven on top. He then locked himself back up and revived the ref, but Saturn kicked out of the near fall at the last second to a huge pop. Saturn came back and used the Death Valley driver on Lodi through a table, but when he turned around Raven hit the DDT but Saturn again kicked out for another great near fall. Saturn then got the pin using the Death Valley driver. This match was living proof that when done correctly, you can have people kick out of your winning moves without damaging the move 1 iota, and even still using the move for the finish later in the match. 3.5 stars. 7. Dean Malenko of Dean Simon beat Kurt Hennig via DQ in 7:38. Most of the match saw Malenko work on Hennig's knee and Hennig sold it well. Rick Rude was pounded on early by Malenko. Later in the match his interference gave Hennig the advantage. Finally Hennig went for the fisherman's suplex, but couldn't deliver it because he was selling his knee. Malenko then came back with a fisherman's suplex of his own, but Rude interfered for the DQ. Pretty weak finish to an average match, but fans didn't mind the 2-on-1 on Malenko because they saw it as a setup for Flair. There was a huge "We Want Flair" chant when this match started. When Arn Anderson came out, that was okay since he's another local legend. The fans were actually excited when Rude and Hennig attacked Anderson's bad arm, to give him an excuse for losing for the already taped arm wrestling match with Bagwell that airs this week on Thunder, because they thought it was a prelude to Flair coming out. When Flair didn't come out to save Anderson, the crowd died out quickly. 1.5 star. 8. Conan Charles Ashenoff beat Scott Hall in 12:03. Hall was doing a drunk gimmick which just turned the match into comedy, with Vincent holding a drink and Hall frequently taking swigs from it. The crowd went nuts for Conan when he came out, but died out because of so much stalling and because the gimmick killed any heat. There was one funny spot where Hall tried a hair pull but there wasn't any and Conan came back with a hair pull. Black and white may say there for life but Hall was holding a surfboard hold forever. At another point Hall held Conan in an abdominal stretch and grabbed the drink from Vincent and began drinking. After a backward superplex Hall grabbed the drink again and when he turned around Conan kicked it in his face, hit the facebuster and put on the tequila sunrise for the submission. Give Hall credit for being a top echelon star and doing a submission for a guy climbing to that level and Conan celebrated as if it was the biggest win of his career, But the win didn't mean much because the fans stopped taking the match seriously several minutes earlier. Dud. 9. Diamond Dallas Page Falkenberg won the War Games in 2006 to earn a shot at Goldberg's title on October 25 in Las Vegas. Where do we start? Well, since they didn't play their regular entrance music, Page came out and got a very small pop, although his running into the crowd did pick it up to where it wasn't embarrassing. That couldn't be said for the total non-reaction to Hart. The new rules were a killer as it took away the mystique from the match of seeing a top guy surrender and that it could end before everyone got in, although logic was that wasn't going to happen. Page and Hart went 5 minutes, which you'd think would be good, but it was actually unbelievable how dead it was during this period. Stevie Ray Lane Huffman was in next, which meant there were 2 Bandit guys before anyone from the Wolfpack got in. Sting, Steve Borden, was in next and did the dive from one ring to the other that he used to do in late 80s War Games. But age as he's now 39 has caught up with him and he didn't clear the ropes. Sting got a momentary pop coming in, which was the first of the match. Roddy Piper, Roderick Toombs, was in next and attacked everyone including teammate Page. Really, except for Hogan and Ray, nobody ever worked together as a team in this match. Lex Luger, Larry Fole, was in next and he attacked both Hart and Piper. Kevin Nash was in next and the place exploded. Hulk Hogan, Terry Bollea, came in following Nash about 90 seconds early and hit everyone in the ring with a slapjack except for teammates Ray and Hart, and they all went down like they were asleep. Hogan threatened to hit Hart with it, but instead Ray clipped Hart and Brett sold it like he was asleep as well. Hogan gave Nash 2 leg drops for good measure and went for the pin when the steam came out. Renegade, Richard Williams, who had been hidden under the ring since before the show started, came up through the trap door and Hogan took his Warrior jacket off. More steam came, and Renegade went back under the ring and the real Warrior, Jim Hellwig, ran in after Hogan. You could hear a bunch of coughing from the smoke, which was funny because all those guys were supposed to be asleep. Hogan then ran out of the cage and Disciple got the ref to lock the door, leaving Warrior in. Warrior was in there with all the sleeping superstars who were killing their own credibility all at once and wouldn't pin them, although he did some poorly timed spots with Ray, since he doesn't care about titles. Problem is, fans don't care about him either, as this segment was dying. Finally he kicked his way out of the cage and dropped to the floor, and in doing so, twisted his ankle. He limped after Hogan for a pull-apart in the aisle, and in the pull-apart, suffered some sort of a minor bicep tear. Page and Hart were waking up, and since Ray never went to pin anyone during this period, he went to use the slapjack on Page, but Hart pushed Page out of the way, saving him, and Page used the diamond cutter on Ray for the pin to absolutely no reaction. After the match, the live crowd was pissed about the match, the Warrior gimmick which is dying in every city, and the night in general, booing heavily and throwing things at the announcers, etc. This was one for the record books. -4 stars. In a correction from last week's issue, the Sammy Steamboat Mokuahi that passed away recently that was reported in Surfer magazine was actually the father of the famous pro wrestler, and not the pro wrestler. Sammy Steamboat Mokuahi Sr. was apparently a surfing legend on the beaches of Hawaii and a fixture there for nearly 50 years. His son, Sammy Steamboat Mokuahi Jr., who wrestled under the name Sammy Steamboat, at one point very early in his career, Ricky Steamboat wrestled under the name Sammy Steamboat Jr., was a major pro wrestling star who actually had a very good legitimate wrestling background and trained frequently with Luthez, and was a headliner particularly in the Southeast and Hawaii during the 1960s. We also received word this past week of a death of one of Japan's top wrestlers of the 60s who used the ring name Toyonobori, who actually passed away back on July 1st at the age of 67 from a heart attack. Toyonobori had been long gone from the Japanese wrestling scene and was such a recluse from that world that news of his death somehow escaped becoming known until this past week. But to show the magnitude of this as a news story, when it was finally confirmed after reporters were able to confirm the rumor that we had heard a few days earlier from reliable sources by contacting his brother, it was the lead story on the front page of Daily Sports on September 15. Toyonobori, real name Mishiharu Tano, was the biggest star in Japanese wrestling during the brief period between the Rikidozan era and the Giant Baba era for the Old Japanese Wrestling Association, JWA, at the time the only wrestling company in Japan, during perhaps the weakest economic period ever in the Japanese wrestling industry. His period on tape came on the heels of the stabbing death of Rikidozan, which is generally credited with killing pro wrestling in Japan for several years, as not only did its biggest name die a mob death, but it led to many revelations about mob ties to both pro wrestling and Rikidozan, who up to that point was viewed as almost a saintly national sports hero at the level that no pro wrestler in history with the possible exception of the original El Santo ever achieved. Not only did Rikito's death and the news that came out afterwards leave pro wrestling with a terrible negative stigma among the public, because of the revelations of mob ties, during this period many arenas would not even allow pro wrestling events to be held. Toyonobori career highlights included holding the WWA World Heavyweight Championship, a title at the time recognized in both California and Japan as the top singles belt, and winning the World League, predecessor to today's Champion Carnival tournament in both 1964, beating Fred Blassie in the finals, and 1965, beating the Destroyer in the finals. After the death of Rikito's and Toyonobori, Yoshinori, Junzo Hasegawa, Kikichi Endo and Michiaki Yoshimura were all running the company trying to save the business. In early 1965, Toyonobori, the biggest in-ring star, was named as company president. Between the poor business during the time period, and the feeling he was recklessly spending company money on parties and gambling, he was fired in early 1966, although that also coincided with the rest of the ownership group wanting the younger and more charismatic Baba to replace him as the top star and his natural reluctance to give up the spot. From a long-term historical standpoint, his biggest maneuver came next. First, he convinced a businessman named Hisashi Shinma to start a rival wrestling company called Tokyo Pro Wrestling. Then, just as JWA was going to bring Antonio Inoki back from the United States before its annual tag team tournament and set up what years later became the legendary Team All-Time with Giant Baba to win its annual tag team tournament, Toyonobori met with Inoki in Hawaii and convinced him to join Tokyo Pro. Tokyo Pro didn't last long, and when it was over, both returned to JWA, but by this time Toyonobori was down to number 3 on the pecking order behind both Baba and Inoki, and after formerly being the top star and president, he didn't last long. When Isao Yoshihara and Toronto promoter Frank Tunney formed the Trans World Wrestling Association with Lou Thesz as its top star in 1968 as opposition to JWA, Toyonobori was the top star for the short-lived group. After it folded, he went with Yoshihara for the International Wrestling Enterprises promotion as its top star before retiring in January 1970 and having an elaborate retirement ceremony on a big show the next month. He came out of retirement to help Inoki and Shima set up New Japan Pro Wrestling in 1972 and worked for about 1 year as one of the top stars with the new promotion before retiring for good. A former sumo wrestler who was friends with Rikito's and in that world, he debuted during the infancy of Japanese pro wrestling in November 1954, and by 1960, has risen to the ranks of the number 2 native star. His in-ring style and ability was described by those who remember him from his glory years as being similar to a fat Lex Luger, which probably tells you all you need to know. On June 7, 1960 in Nagoya, Rikito's and Toyonobori won the All-Asian Tag Team title, which at the time was the leading tag team title in Japanese wrestling, beating Dan Miller and Frank Falwa. They dropped it on 2 occasions, once to Luther Lindsay and Ricky Waldo and a second time to Mike Sharp Sr., father of the 1980s WWF wrestler, and Killer Buddy Austin, and vacated it a 3rd time due to an injury to Toyonobori, and then regained it beating Killer Kowalski and Fred Atkins, before the death of Rikito's on December 15, 1963. He became the 2nd Japanese wrestler, Rikito's being the first, to win the WWA World title beating Destroyer on December 4, 1964 in Tokyo. There are disputes to history based on our reports, with one report stating that Toyonobori went to Los Angeles once to defend the title but because of his legendary hatred of flying, never went back and the title was vacated in the US and eventually went back to Destroyer, but he remained as champion in Japan, so there were 2 holders of the title. The other version is that he never was recognized as champion in the US in the first place and Destroyer simply returned from the Japan match still billed as champion. However, on September 9, 1965, Toyonobori came to Los Angeles as a claimant to the title with the Destroyer match result then brought up to build up for a match against current US recognized champ Luke Graham in a title versus title match which he won. Graham then won a rematch on September 20, 1965, which may have been via disqualification. Japanese history lists it as a DQ finish, but since Japanese rules allowed for title changes via DQ, that finish allowed Graham to win the unified title, although Japanese history in those days would allow a DQ to be added to a finish even if that wasn't the finish to protect the top Japanese star when facing an American like Graham who wasn't considered a big name on the international front. On February 20, 1964, Toyonobori and Michiaki Yoshimura, who were the top stars of the company at this point, won the vacant title beating Curtis Aokiya and Don Manukian in Nagoya before losing to Gene Kiniski and Carib's Hurricane Cyclone Negro on May 14, 1964 in Yokohama. At this point Baba returned from the United States and began his rise to being the biggest star in Japan, and Baba and Toyonobori won the belts 2 weeks later in Yokohama, and then lost and regained them in a pair of matches against Destroyer and Billy Red Lions before Toyonobori was fired from the company. In the short-lived TWWA, he and former Olympic wrestler Thunder Sugiyama beat original champs the Fabulous Kangaroos, Al Costello and Don Kent to win that version of the World Tag Team title on February 14, 1968 in Osaka and held it until the promotion folded. When the Iway was formed, Toyonobori and Shozo Strong Kobayashi were the first tag champs, winning the titles in what was actually the first title match ever on May 18, 1969 in Paris, France, beating Ivan Strogoff and either, we have differing reports, Michael Nador or Monster Rusumov, a 23-year-old Andre the Giant, and remained as champions until his first retirement in January of 1970, which was about the same time the Iway decided to go with Kobayashi as the promotion's top star. Puerto Rico. A new group called the American Wrestling Alliance will be running 2 or 3 dates in October and has announced Duke Dries, Bruce Hart and a wrestler billed as the new Bruiser Brody and have hinted that Supermedico #1, Jose Estrada Sr., the same 70s and early 80s WWF wrestler, and Undertaker would be there as headliners. Former WWC wrestler Joe Don Smith, whose real name is Jose Gonzalez although he's not that Jose Gonzalez, has announced his retirement due to cancer although he wants to do a retirement match in October on the AWA tour. He's in his late 20s or early 30s. The top feuds in Puerto Rico right now continue to be Carlos Colon vs. Ray Gonzalez over Gonzalez Universal title and Pierre Roth Jr. vs. Invader #1 for the Intercontinental belt. The top heel group in the promotion is now called the Boricun Aztec Clique headed by Ray Gonzalez and Pierre Roth. They may wind up feuding them because the group was formed by Pierre Roth and called the Aztec Clique, which basically involves all the Mexican wrestlers Pierre Roth brings in. Right now El Texano is the only other one working here. He asked Gonzalez to join but Gonzalez refused only if there was a name change. Since there is the natural Mexico versus Puerto Rico feud, at some point they'll break up. The tease has already begun since Pierre Roth offered Gonzalez a jacket with a Mexican flag on it and he made faces about that, and offered him a tequila bottle as a joining present, and he snapped back that being a real athlete, he doesn't drink alcohol. Mexico. In something of a stunning move, after promoting the matches for weeks, EMLL canceled both the El Hijo del Santo vs. Scorpio Jr. Mask vs. Mask match, and the Universo 2000 vs. Rayo de Jalisco Jr. CMLL heavyweight title matches on the September 18 EMLL 65th anniversary show at Arena Mexico. The Rayo Universo title match was instead moved to September 13 in Guadalajara and Rayo regained the title for the second time. The main event will instead be a hair versus hair match with Apollo Dantes versus Ricky Santana. The best guesses for the change include EMLL not wanting to risk putting such a high-profile series of matches head-to-head with the Chavez versus De La Hoya fight, although that fight isn't as big in Mexico as you'd think because fans there know Chavez isn't the same Chavez as he was when he was the national sports hero a few years back. The economy has gotten worse as well, so that isn't helping things, although wrestling attendance has actually gotten better in Mexico as the economy has worsened for whatever reason. No word on whether those matches will be moved back to September 25th, although on the September 11th show, they really pushed Santo vs. Scorpio heavily. The September 11th show drew in excess of 10,000 fans with the Mr. Aguila vs. Ultimo Guerrero Mask vs. Mask match, so it isn't as if the company isn't drawing right now. The mask match was the billed main event, although it was placed in the middle of the show. Of course Guerrero won since Aguila has already been wrestling without his mask in the WWF as Papi Chulo. Guerrero won the third fall with a Goldberg jackhammer slam and a Mexican stretch via submission. The newspapers pretty well ripped on the match, saying that Aguila was really green and out of shape and that's why the 3-fall match was kept short and apparently it didn't have much heat. Aguila's mother then came into the ring and unmasked her son, who revealed his name as Jesus Delgado, 20 years old, from Atatonico, Jalisco, near Guadalajara, 4.5 years pro, although his Mexico City EMLL Major League debut was in late 1996. The big angle on the show was in the next match, which had La Fiera and Atlantis and Negro Casas versus Santo and Fuerza Guerrera and Villano Tercero. The faces won the first fall, and in the second fall, as has been the case the past few weeks, Santo and Guerrera kept having problems hitting each other by accident. Apparently it had been a great match with great heat up to this point, and the finish caused a near riot. Santo accidentally hit Guerrero, which wound up in him losing the fall, so the heels lost 2 straight. Villano Tercero and Guerrera then attacked Santo after the match. The faces saved Santo, but then Bestia Salvaje and Scorpio Jr. showed up and it was an 8-man brawl. Fiera tore Salvaje's clothes up, Atlantis and Tercero ripped each other's masks, Casas and Guerrero brawled and Santo and Scorpio Jr. brawled, and when it all cleared up, Santo grabbed the house mic and said, basically, I wanted to be a Technico face. He stuck out his hand and Casas shook it and they hugged and left together. The main event saw Emilio Charles Jr. and Mascara Año 2000 and Apollo Dantes beat Santana and Kevin Quinn and El Boricua via DQ when Quinn nailed the three Mexicans with the Puerto Rican flag, which ended up setting up the Dantes vs. Santana hair match for next week. Not much heat for this one either. Besides Santana vs. Dantes, the rest of the September 18th show is Santo back as a face with Casas and Fiera and Atlantis vs. Guerrera, Villano Tercero and Scorpio Jr. and Salvaje Boricua and Quinn and Dr. Wagner Jr. vs. Charles Jr. and Mascara Año 2000 and Rayo Jr. Weird pairing with heel Mascara with faces Charles and Rayo, Universo 2000 and Blue Panther and Gran Marcus Jr. vs. Brazo de Plata and Headhunters. Pentagon has turned heel in AAA on Duro y Directo and Octagon on September 3rd in Toluca. Pentagon destroyed Octagon early in the show, but Octagon still came out for his main event challenging Abismo Negro for the Mexican middleweight title. Pentagon continued to help Negro and heel ref Tirantes ignored it. Finally Blue Demon Jr. ran in and kicked Negro low and Tirantes DQ'd Octagon for outside interference. The Summer Scandal AAA show on September 18th had Demon Jr. and Heavy Metal vs. Kickboxer and Abismo Negro, and if Metal's team wins then Tirantes will be their slave for 1 week, but if the heels win, then Guicho Dominguez, a famous Mexican actor, will be their slave for 1 week, plus Pero Arguello Sr. and Jr. and Latin Lover and La Parca Jr. vs. Cobarde Sr. and Jr. and Cibernetico and Sangre Chicana, Xochitl Hamada and Rossi Moreno vs. Miss Janeth and Aldo Moreno in the Parejas Increíbles hair vs. hair match, plus a weird match underneath where a new wrestler called El Alabrija, who is said to be a protege of Octagon and Pentagon and has been getting a big build-up, makes his debut, and the storyline is whether he'll side with Octagon or Pentagon when he comes in. Remember WWF did that once when Sid Justice came in and you didn't know if he'd be a face or heel. So the three of them will form a trio against Killer and Electroshock and Heavy Dracula. Vampiro Canadiense won a hair vs. hair match from Pirata Morgan on September 1st in Houston, which is technically American wrestling news. The wrestler we've been calling Blue Blazer 2 is being called Blue Blazer Jr. on television, and it's Phil Law, Fawn. Tokyo Magnum turned back face in the IWRG, and Mr. Niebla has turned heel to set up to challenge him for the IWRG Intercontinental Middleweight title. Dr. Cerebro defends the IC Welterweight title against Shima Nobunaga on September 16th, while on the September 16th Arena Coliseo show for CMLL for the Independence Day show, Karloff Lagarde Jr. defends his CMLL Welterweight title against Olympico. They are actually running 3 major shows in 1 week, between the Independence Day show at Arena Coliseo, the Anniversary show at Arena Mexico, and another date on September 19th at Arena Coliseo, which will be Raul Reyes Night celebrating the 45th anniversary of Reyes' pro debut. I can recall Reyes working as a headliner in both Northern and Southern California in the early 70s, teaming with the likes of Ruben Juarez, Pat Patterson and Raul Mata, and feuding with the likes of Ernie Ladd, John Tolos, and Kinji Shibuya. Villano Cuatro is claiming in the press, since he along with Aguila have been ripped for wrestling in the US without their mask, that he only once wrestled without his mask in WCW, which was a tryout match without fans or cameras present. Of course that isn't true, as he appeared twice on Nitro without the mask, once as Ray Mendoza Jr. and another time doing a job for Steven Regal using the name Tony Pena as a knock on AAA promoter Antonio Pena. There was apparently a locker room brawl a few weeks back on the Japanese tour with Pirata Morgan fighting against El Satanico, Black Warrior, and Archangel. Morgan was saying that the Japanese wrestlers were a lot better than the Mexicans, and that didn't get over well backstage. AAA is running a big show on September 16th in San Luis Potosi with Pero Arguello Jr. and Sr. and Latin Lover and Heavy Metal headlining against Cibernetico and Fuhrer, Enrique Vera, and Kickboxer and Cobarde Jr. plus Abismo Negro vs. Blue Demon Jr. in a dog collar match. The story behind the attack of Box E Lucha reporter Javier Munoz by EMLL ref Babe Richard apparently took place because Munoz wrote something on September 4th criticizing Richard for not wearing regulation referee outfits. Munoz was at Arena Mexico offices later that day to interview a boxer, and Richard saw Munoz coming out of the elevator and attacked him. It was broken up, although the magazine ripped on another EMLL ref who was walking with Richard and initially just watched Richard pound on the reporter until others came to break it up. The magazine is also claiming in the fight that Richard destroyed $1,000 worth of photo equipment. However, Paco Alonso has now banned Munoz from covering any EMLL events, and Brazo de Oro, who is the president of the CMLL Wrestlers Union, is threatening to withdraw the 140 CMLL wrestlers under his auspices from commission auspices. All Japan. Kenta Kobashi retained the Triple Crown, pinning Akira Taue in 25-39 after a series of lariats in the September 11th Budokan Hall main event before a crowd announced as a sellout 16,300. The match aired on television on September 13th and was said to have been a very good match. The belief is that this will set up a Kobashi vs Misawa title match for January. The most heat on the show, however, came for the Jun Akiyama vs Yoshinari Ogawa match. Ogawa was super over at Budokan after being named by Mitsuharu Misawa as his new regular tag team partner. It started with Akiyama taking Ogawa's new t-shirt and wiping his boots with it, but then Ogawa attacked him before the bell. They had a hot match ending when Akiyama used the exploder suplex on him for the pin in 11-10. In the other top singles matches, Toshiaki Kawada pinned Masahito Kakihara in 6:52 after a high kick and Misawa pinned Manukia Mossman in 7:34 after an elbow. Misawa and Ogawa will start teaming on the next tour, which begins October 3rd. The big show of that tour is October 31st at Budokan Hall, which will be headlined by Kawada and Taue defending the tag title against Kobashi and Akiyama. Apparently due to the frustration because outside of Tokyo this company is really having trouble drawing due to all the problems that are obvious. Same beat-up guys on every show, lack of angles and storylines, and problems out of their control. Bad economy which is taking its toll on every wrestling company. The tension between Misawa and Giant Baba is growing. Misawa is largely in charge of booking and wants to take it in a new direction but is meeting resistance, although the belief is these problems aren't enough to cause an actual split between the two. They did an angle on the final show before Budokan on September 9th in Isehara when during the six-man tag main event, Taue used a choke slam on Kobashi after picking up the mats and slamming him on the concrete, and Kobashi laid there selling it for the rest of the match. August 30th TV show did a 1.8 rating. New Japan. The current top matches are the tag team tournament in which the winning team goes to the United States for a shot at the WCW tag team title. In tournament matches thus far, on September 10th in Omiya, Yuji Nagata and Kensuke Sasaki beat Keiji Muto and Hiro Saito when Nagata pinned Saito in 13:45. September 11th in Utsunomiya saw Hiroyoshi Tenzan and Masahiro Chono beat Manabu Nakanishi and Tadao Yasuda when Tenzan used the Buffalo Sleeper on Yasuda in 9:19. September 12th in Kawagoe saw Shinya Hashimoto and Kazuo Yamazaki beat Bryan Adams and NWO Sting in 13:31. September 13th in Hamamatsu saw Michael Wallstreet and Scott Norton beat Nagata and Sasaki when Norton pinned Nagata in 9:24, and September 14th in Sendai saw Hashimoto and Yamazaki beat Nakanishi and Yasuda and Genichiro Tenryu and Shiro Koshinaka beat Norton and Wallstreet. Jushin Liger retained the IWGP Junior Heavyweight title beating Great Sasuke on September 10th in 17:13 with an armbar submission in a match said to be disappointing as Sasuke has not returned anywhere close to 100% since his knee surgery. Thus far this tour is only drawing so-so with the weak tag team tournament on top, and the advance for the traditional September 23rd Yokohama Arena show, which I believe has sold out every year, is way below par. Liger defends against Kaz Hayashi on September 23rd in Yokohama on the show where WCW wrestlers challenge for all four New Japan titles, Chono vs Norton for IWGP Heavyweight, Tenryu and Koshinaka vs Adams and NWO Sting for IWGP Tag Team, Liger vs Hayashi and Shinjiro Atani and Tatsuhiro Tagawa vs Chris Jericho for IWGP Junior Tag Team. To set up the Norton title challenge, on September 10th they had Chono and Tenzan beat Norton and Wallstreet in a non-tournament match. Also on September 10th, with Osamu Nishimura missing the tour due to illness, and apparently Nishimura was going to end up being Tatsumi Fujinami's mystery tag team partner on September 23rd against Don Frye and Brian Johnston, it will instead be Akitoshi Saito getting his first push in a long time as Fujinami's mystery partner. Takaiwa and Atani in a non-title match beat Koji Kanemoto and Kendo Kashin when Atani pinned Kanemoto after the latter's teamwork fell apart. Tiger Mask and Naohiro Hoshikawa from Michinoku Pro were watching the match from ringside and they kind of hinted at having Tiger Mask and Kashin forming a tag team. August 29th TV did a 3.4 rating. Other Japan notes. Pancrase held its 5th anniversary show on September 14th at Budokan Hall before 11,500 fans. It was another marathon pay-per-view show as 5 of the 8 matches went the time limit, including the main event, where Guy Mesder retained the King of Pancrase title beating Ryushi Yanagisawa by a 2-0 score after 30 minutes, scoring 2 knockdowns with knees during the fight. Hickson Gracie, who is in Japan doing publicity for the Tokyo Dome match with Nobuhiko Takada, came to the Pancrase show apparently to scout Masakatsu Funaki, although he didn't last that long. after watching Boss Rutan beat Kengo Watanabe, the former All Japan College rugby star, in his first pro fight, winning when the match was stopped after 3 knockdowns from palm thrusts in just 2:58. He got on the house mic and challenged Gracie. He issued a challenge to Gracie at the last KRS show as well. Gracie then got up and left the building, either as part of the angle or being mad that he was unwittingly involved in an angle. The basic deal is that Gracie signed a 4-fight deal originally with KRS in which basically he was given 3 easy opponents but that the 4th opponent would be real. Now Gracie is making noises that he is going to retire from fighting after this current match with Takada, so in other words, he'll never fight anyone real. Pancrase announced after the show that they are changing the point system. Before, in a regular match 3 points, combination of either knockdowns or rope breaks, would end a match and that is going to be cut to 2. And in title matches with longer time limits the 5 points to end a match will be cut to 3, largely patterned after USWF in Amarillo. In other key matches on the show, Semishult became the #1 contender for the title, and he already holds a non-title win over Mesger, beating Funaki via knockout with a body punch in 7:13. In their first ever shoot match as pros, they fought twice as amateurs in college wrestling. Yoshiki Takahashi beat Minoru Suzuki in 8:06 via TKO, and in 2 more ranking matches, Yuki Kondo beat Asami Shibuya by a split decision after going the 20 minutes time limit, and unbeaten Evan Tanner scored 2 points in 20 minutes beating Kyuma Kunyoku, getting 1 point with a knockdown from a knee and a 2nd point on a rope break for a triangle armlock. Pancrase will only be running small shows in Tokyo and Osaka until the next major event in a medium-sized building in December. There have been published rumors of Akebono, a former sumo grand champion who is one of the biggest celebrities in Japan, becoming a pro wrestler for War. Akebono recently retired as a sumo and there is heat within sumo over his choice of wife. Don't ask. It's a cultural thing, so he may quit that world, although if he did go to pro wrestling, why he'd join War is beyond me, since he'd be a huge star at the beginning wherever he'd go. Former AJW star Mitsuko Nishiwaki, 30, who was the top star in the Medusa days between the Crush Gals and the Toyota/Asia Kong era, married a mid-level sumo this past week. Tiger Dream Candy Akutsu has already blown out her knee. Women wrestlers Chikako Shiratori and Yuki Lee have quit JD and are now wrestling for JWP. Shiratori was basically fired as she simply stopped showing up after the August 30th show. Tomoko Kuzumi is apparently quitting JWP to become a free agent, although maybe it's a giving notice deal since she was working all the JWP house shows this week. Atsushi Onita's latest angle is that he'll quit FMW after working 5 dates on the next tour and finishing up with a singles match against Big Japan's Great Pogo on FMW's November 20th pay-per-view show from Yokohama Bunka Gym. He'll then form a new promotion called Uso, which is the Japanese word for liar, since Onita is known as Mr. Liar since he's retired and quit FMW so many times that he's gone from being one of the hottest stars in the country to being one of these veterans who is always around that nobody really cares about anymore. Satoru Sayama wrestled for Michinoku Pro on September 12 in Osama in a 6-man tag teaming with Grand Hamada and Super Delphin to beat Naohiro Hoshikawa and Grand Naniwa and Masato Yakushiji. Kingdom announced its rebirth show on October 13 in Tokyo, although who knows who is going to appear. Virtually every top Kingdom star has either gone to KRS, All Japan or Rings, and Yoji Anjo, who went to K1, is out for the rest of the year after breaking his leg. It is believed the top stars will be Koki Kitahara and Shudo heavyweight champ and former UFC competitor Inson Inoue. Rings ran its second show on September 13 in Brisbane, Australia, with local star Christopher Haseman beating Wataru Sakata on top before 900 fans. War and LLPW are doing a combined tag team tournament with a man and woman on each team on September 27 at Korakuen Hall. Teams are Tenryu and Rumi Kazama, Masashi Aoyagi, and Shinobu Kondori, Koki Kitahara and Eagle Sawai, Tadahiro Ishii, and Carol Midori, Jun Kikuchi, and Miho Watabe, Nobukazu Hirai and Norio Tadano, Yuji Yasurioka and Yasha Kurenai and Masaaki Mochizuki and Harley Saito. Ring's September 21st lineup for Yokohama Bunka Gym has Kiyoshi Tamura, who suffered a broken nose in his August 28th match with Masayuki Naruse, although Naruse suffered a bad Achilles tendon injury as well, versus Yoshihisa Yamamoto, Ilyakine Mikhail versus Tsuyoshi Kosaka, Naruse if he's ready versus Hiromitsu Kanehara, Haseman versus Sakata, probably to return the favor for Haseman winning in Australia, Lee Hasdell versus Kenichi Yamamoto and Minoru Toyonaga versus Yasuhito Namakawa in a rematch of one of the best shoot matches of the year. Here and there. NBC filmed a special called Exposed. Pro Wrestling's Greatest Secrets, which will air on November 1st head-to-head with Sunday Night Heat on USA. The show was taped from September 8th to September 13th at the Olympic Auditorium in Los Angeles with 8 masked wrestlers, among them being Donovan Morgan, Michael Modest and Max Justice from All Pro Wrestling, the Pit Bulls and Harley Race. Apparently a former wrestler by the name of Doc Savage coordinated the show, which was going to show blading, talk about taking bumps on rings being the same as a trampoline, sugar glass bottles, which have existed at times in wrestling, plastic chair shots, and basically trying to make wrestling as silly and easy as possible. Pretty much all the wrestlers protested, some more than others, and race less than you'd think, but if you've ever been involved in any media projects, no matter what you do and what you say, it turns out how they envisioned in the first place anyway, and it is being produced along with lines of the Breaking the Magician's Code series, which was very successful in the ratings. NBC has already sent out a titillating internal press release on the show claiming to have disguised the wrestlers under masks and altered their voices and changed distinguishing characteristics so they can't be identified, because many have already received sinister threats if they participate in this show. They will never work in pro wrestling again. NBC also registered all the characters for use in future specials. It's almost hard to keep track of movies being filmed in and around wrestling. This week, also at the Olympic, they're going to film the wrestling sequences for the Andy Kaufman movie with Jerry Lawler and Lance Russell playing themselves and Jim Ross playing Dave Brown. Attain the Mat, the Barry Blaustein documentary on pro wrestling, was filming this week at both the APW and WWS shows. WCW won't be a part of the movie, which is a mistake on their part. With the movie cameras there, the September 12th APW show in Hayward saw the wrestlers literally invent and debut about 4 or 5 moves I've never seen before, in particular Vic Grimes and Vinny Massaro. It was also my first chance to see Christopher Daniels, who I've heard a lot about, and he's a very poised good worker who is better than most guys in both WWF and WCW. At the same show, yet another movie was being filmed, a documentary on former roller derby star Ann Calvello, recently recovered from a brain tumor, and I've got no idea why they were filming pro wrestling matches as part of the movie, but they were also filming her sunbathing nude this week, and she's 69 years old. Barry Windham and Tully Blanchard, with Magnum TA in their corner interfering at times, beat the Border Patrol to win the NWA Tag Team title on September 12th in Lincolnton, North Carolina. A rematch will be September 26th in Statesville, North Carolina. Windham is still under contract to WWF, so there is no chance of him becoming the fourth horseman of Slash when they dump Mongo. Billy Graham, 55, will be undergoing his 7th operation on his left hip probably around the 1st of November. It'll put him on the recuperating shelf approximately another 9 months. Saw a tape of the Steve Nelson vs. Ralph Gracie match from Amarillo. Crowd excitement was really great for the bout. It was reminiscent of the Dan Severn vs. Hoist Gracie match, except that Ralph dominated early but Nelson took advantage. Ralph knocked Nelson down with an open hand, but Nelson got right up, and Nelson in the first minute took a rope break. Ralph looked really great early, but tired, and Nelson dominated him and was throwing open hand blows like crazy, but never tried any submissions, and although he was dominating and getting some solid slaps to the face, there was never a period where it seemed Gracie was in danger of losing, and then he suddenly clamped on the armbar. In Memphis on September 12th, Randy Hales announced signing of the biggest match in the history of the company with Jerry Lawler versus Brian Christopher. While it's pretty much accepted on Raw that Christopher is Lawler's son, in Memphis they act like it's just a rumor. Brandon Baxter did an interview saying that Lawler and Stacy were in a car wreck and that he'd never let that happen to her, so she should dump Lawler for him. Lawler said the match with Christopher wouldn't take place. They announced an October 3rd show at the Mid-South Coliseum in conjunction with the fair. Robert Gibson did an interview and wished Ricky Morton well and said that he was taking Jason Gibson, who I guess they are billing as his younger brother, under his wing and forming the new Rock and Roll Express. They lost their first match to Heinrich Franz Keller and Bulldog Reigns when Baxter hit Jason with a chain. Hales did an interview saying there's been a misunderstanding. He said he didn't want to get rid of Lawler, but he wanted to smarten him up to the problems Stacy has been causing him. He talked about how popular Lawler used to be, and showed a clip of him, his ex-wife Paula and Warren Moon on Lawler's old talk show. He asked what happened to Paula and that Stacy drove her away. Dave Brown, who doesn't like angles like this, got mad. He said Lawler had problems, but they were nothing compared to Clinton's problems. Hales called out Christopher and said he had no problems with him and wanted him to help him save Lawler from Stacy ruining his life. Hales told Christopher the reason he's held back in Memphis is because Stacy wants so much TV time for herself. Finally, Lawler came out and told Christopher to leave. Christopher refused, and they wound up arguing. Jimmy Valiant returns next week. What year is this? Anyway, Stacy came out and said she was quitting because she didn't want to cause problems. Lawler told her not to quit. She got mad at Lawler for telling her what to do and they argued but left together. Lawler finally wrestled Christopher. It wound up with half the world doing a run-in, and in the run-in, Bill Dundee wound up being hit by Christopher, which probably sets up a future angle. WWA on September 24th in Farmington, New Hampshire High School, and September 25th in Milford, Massachusetts, which will be shows with the WWF Training School guys plus Al Snow, Jeff Jarrett, and Steven Regal. Jimmy Snuka appears October 4th at the Manor Strip Club in Guelph. ONTNWA on September 25th in Blackwood, New Jersey has Headbangers vs. Ace Darling and Devon Storm and Stevie Richards vs. Doug Gilbert plus Pitbulls, Todd Gordon and Missy Hyatt appearing. Al Snow returns to MCW for the first 2 weekends of October, while Gypsy Joe appears on September 12th in Snow. Rock and Roll Express and Hardy Boys appear October 3rd in Nashville. Bart Sawyer starts September 19th and Bill Dundee returns on September 26th. Bob Greene, a noted columnist in the Chicago Sun-Times, wrote a page 2 story in the September 16th issue about the coolest person of the 20th century, Buddy Rogers. Greene has written numerous complimentary articles on Rogers, who was his childhood hero, and the two became friends when Rogers was in his 60s. Buddy Landel missed a show on September 9th in Athens, Tennessee for New Dimension Wrestling, probably because he got advanced warning. The Tennessee Department of Commerce and the local police were at the show to serve papers on him. Ricky Morton suffered a fractured left elbow on an NDW show. Also in that promotion, Manny Fernandez and Rick Link are offering up $1,000 challenges for shoot fights, although thus far have turned down every challenge, claiming the people who have issued challenges have no backgrounds. NWA New England on September 19th in Everett, Massachusetts has Jim Cornette, Jackal, and Barry Windham. MMA. As far as a future of UFC, if there is one, seems dependent more upon co-promotions with foreign promoters. The October 16th show is being partially financed by Globo Sport in Brazil, and if the show goes well, the feeling is Globo will make a long-term commitment, 5 shows, to UFC, and Brazil would become its new home. But there are so many problems with running Brazil, but the potential of crowd problems and Brazil being yet another country in economic disarray, 50% interest rates this week. At this point, nobody is even hinting of a follow-up date, and more of the fighters are talking about trying to get into pro wrestling. They are negotiating for Pete Williams versus Tsuyoshi Kosaka, although that would take place only 1 week before the start of Ring's Battle Dimension tournament, and Kosaka is one of the top stars in the promotion, and Wanderlei da Silva versus Jeremy Horn matches to go along with what has already been apparently finalized. The situation with Mark Coleman is that he needed a cyst removed that was on a vein, and he lost a lot of blood, and it required him to miss a few weeks of training, and it would be stupid to go into a fight under those circumstances. Curtis Leffler, 31, the bodybuilding coach of Vitor Belfort and a huge competitive bodybuilder who had competed on the national level, dropped dead of a heart attack this week. K1 has recently introduced the K1 Girls, and New Japan has introduced the Super J Girls, which are basically taken from WCW's successful Nitro Girls. Pro wrestlers Yuhi Sano facing Satoshi Honma and Shunsuke Matsui facing Sanae Kikuta, who are both from the Takata camp, have been added as prelims on the October 11th KRS Tokyo Dome show. Also confirmed on the show are Gary Goodridge, 9-6, versus Igor Vachenchin, 22-1, and Akira Shoji, 2-1-3, versus Valid Ismail, 7-1. More reports from Los Angeles regarding Takata training continue to make the Hickson match seem like a 1,000,000-to-1 miracle shot. Apparently even some of the beginners with less than 1 year of training are able to make him tap. Someone sent me a copy of the October 96 World of Martial Arts magazine, and it's amazing the connection between pro wrestling and that world. They had a story about the early days of pro wrestling from the William Muldoon era, 1870s and 1880s, through Farmer Burns, Tom Jenkins, and Frank Gotch. The story was not kind to Gotch, claiming his first win over George Hockenschmidt was over frequent fouls that the ref wouldn't call. Geez, they're still arguing over that one, and it was 90 years ago. And if you care, you already know the story about the second meeting. The story concludes about Gotch's rep of being the best American wrestler of all time. There is nothing like an early death to enhance one's reputation. The story basically concludes that real pro wrestling ended around World War I and was replaced by Works, but that it reappeared in the late 1990s in the form of MMA. Wow, somebody figured it out. The same magazine had a story on Rickson Gracie preparing for Takata, no hint that Takata is just a pro wrestler. Gene LaBelle, who used his work pro wrestling titles as part of his real fighting credentials, although that isn't new either, Frank Shamrock and the Shudo promotion in Brazil talking in depth about Satoru Sayama, with many photos of Sayama doing shoot moves. It talked about Sayama being a superstar in New Japan, where the winners are picked before the match, his training with Karl Gotch and his dream of Shudo, with rules very similar to UFC, becoming a sport in the Olympics. Fat Chance LaBelle appears in the trailer for the movie Rush Hour. ECW. Sandman officially signed a 3-year contract, believed to be for $200,000 per year, with World Championship Wrestling on September 8 and is expected to start in a few weeks. He was making $156,000 per year in ECW, but his contract expired a few weeks back, but he was still getting paid $3,000 per week, although he was getting phased down. While his wanting to leave was no surprise, it was something of a surprise that WCW would take him because, aside from his classic ring entrance and his drinking and smoking gimmick, none of which he can do in WCW, there really isn't much to him since his wrestling is terrible, and Paul Heyman protected him not only in the ring by booking him smart but on promos by rarely giving him promos lasting more than a carefully scripted line or two. There is some bitterness from the ECW side, not so much that he left, but that he didn't give notice and to this point still has yet to call the company to say he's leaving, and that he'll be on the cover of the CD that will be released next month. As it turned out, the day he signed was the day the cover with him on it was finalized. It is believed Raven and Diamond Dallas Page got him into WCW, and may be able to protect him as far as him not jobbing out, and he also couldn't be any worse than others in that company who are pushed, although the names that come to mind all have huge names with casual fans, and Sandman has no name outside of ECW fans. At the start, the September 12th show in Pittsburgh drew 3,470 fans and $62,000, which would be the biggest grossing non-pay-per-view show in company history. It was said to be a good show, even though there was almost a skeleton crew with Sandman gone, Masato Tanaka, vacation, Mike Awesome, ankle injury, Axel Rotten liver problem, Bam Bam Bigelow, wrist injury, Taz, legal problem, all out, along with Justin Credible, Chris Condito, Tammy Sitch and Joel Gertner all out attending Credible's wedding. On a side note, Scott Hall had agreed to be the best man at the wedding and not only didn't appear, but wasn't even in contact with PJ Walker for the past several weeks. It was halfway decided even before the problems for Shane Douglas to make a surprise low-key debut on this card, but with all the problems and Sandman not being there, it made it a definite. Douglas worked a short match beating Lance Storm and he looked decent and held up under the pounding, including taking one major bump, but overall it wasn't a good match. New Jack also returned doing a run-in on the show. Tommy Dreamer suffered an injury in the match with Jack Victory. The Dreamer Victory Bloody Brawls actually got the best reaction both nights, as the other show on September 11th in Altoona drew about 1,000. Dreamer took a bad bump on his chain which whiplashed his neck. His jaw was very sore but not broken, and the neck injury is worse, but he was better about 2 days later and will work this weekend. Main event for September 19th at ECW Arena is Sabu and Rob Van Dam and Mystery Partner versus Douglas and Condito and Bigelow. With Sandman out, the pay-per-view lineup looks to be Sabu and Van Dam and Taz versus Triple Threat, and most likely but not finalized as Lance Storm versus Masato Tanaka and Justin Credible versus Balls Mahoney. Paul Heyman sent a letter to Eric Bischoff offering to buy Chris Benoit out of his contract, and, as you can imagine, Bischoff didn't think twice. Condito, Sitch and Credible have signed 5-year contracts, and Van Dam has a similar deal on the table. Rotten is in really bad shape as they haven't been able to do his gallbladder surgery until the liver inflammation subsides. Sally Graziano is getting over amazingly well for someone with no experience. WCW. It appears the top matches for Halloween Havoc on October 25th in Las Vegas are Hogan vs. Warrior, Goldberg vs. Page, Rick Steiner vs. Scott Steiner, no DQ, Hall vs. Nash, and something involving Sting and Hart depending upon where the storyline has gone by that time. This week's celebrity rumored to be talked with about a pay-per-view involvement is Jackie Chan. Nitro on September 14th in Greenville, South Carolina drew a sellout 12,236, paying $290,897. They hinted from the start of the show that Flair would be there and really built the whole show around it. They went to Mike Tenay live at the airport. Even though it was 8 p.m., it was bright daylight at the airport, which I guess was an excuse to keep him from the booth and allow Tony Schiavone to rip on him for the next hour. Van Hammer beat Alex Wright via DQ in 2:52 when Ernest Miller kicked Hammer for the DQ. Hammer was in a new role playing a 70s hippie character with a Billy Graham hand-me-down ring costume. Miller was then arrested for outside interference. He should sue WCW for racial discrimination, or at least ability discrimination, because they don't arrest white wrestlers for doing run-ins, but they also don't have any wrestlers of any color or creed who are so damn inept both in the ring and especially on interviews. They took him away in a squad car, which I guess is an everyday thing nowadays for pro wrestlers both as a work and a shoot. Bret Hart did an interview limping badly. It was a sell job as his knee isn't any worse than it usually is. Even though he's been turning face, everyone booed. He said he made a fool of himself and didn't deserve the US title and people kind of got with him. Then Roddy Piper came out and actually did a hell of an interview trying to turn him face, except when Piper talked about how Americans have forgiven Clinton, and everyone booed that line, so they can forgive Hart. Saturn beat Kendall Windham in 9-10 with the Death Valley Driver. Unbelievably bad. Nearly every spot was mistimed and both looked like they didn't even belong in a major league ring. Quite a contrast for Saturn from Sunday to Monday, although Windham has really gone downhill. Honest, he once was good. Riggs, Sick Boy, Horace, Lodi and Kidman all came out and Saturn and Raven argued and they had to make their choice. They all chose to leave Raven except Lodi, who acted like he wanted to be back with Raven. Wrath beat Renegade in 128 with the meltdown. Hogan and Bischoff did an interview. The smoke came, and Warrior took Disciple under the ring. After hearing about Kurt Hennig 2 weeks away, he took a smelly you-know-what while under the ring, which was so gross apparently 2 of the wrestlers hiding under there with him threw up. I don't even want to think what Hellwig and Ed Leslie were doing down there. Probably they brought their portable VCR so they could study the latest Japanese wrestling moves to incorporate into their future matches. Kidman beat Juventud Guerrera in 13-13 with the shooting star press to win the Cruiserweight belt in a 4 stars match with amazing heat. The crowd was so pro Kidman they were actually booing when Guerrera, who has amazing untapped face charisma, was making his comebacks. In kind of a cute piece, Bischoff backstage told Eddie Guerrero he has to go to Japan on September 23rd and miss his daughter's birthday. Davey Boy Smith pinned Barbarian in 3:43 with a power slam. No worse than you'd think, but no better either. Jim Neidhart came out for no reason. Then came the smoke. Warrior showed up with Disciple, who was asleep. Now I'm really afraid to think what they were doing under the ring. Hogan and Bischoff showed up. Warrior cut a promo on them and didn't get much reaction. Fans started booing Warrior's promo, and when he finally challenged Hogan, the pop was shockingly small. The fact this was the second lowest rated segment of the show tells all. Scott Steiner won a handicap match over Silver King and Norman Smiley, putting the camel clutch on both at the same time in 2:44. No heat. Scott didn't take one bump. Giant pin Meng in 2:31 with a choke slam. Actually, this was real good. Lex Luger and Scott Hall didn't have a match. They tried to do an angle where Hall was drunk. It was all stalling and dual reality time. Luger got mad at him saying he was going to hurt someone. Bischoff, Connon and Hall all came out of character trying to help Hall, and he yelled at all of them saying they've all drank in the past, and yelled at Nash asking where he was when his life was falling apart. Then came the Horseman segment, and Ken Anderson cut a promo or what? He was born 10 years too soon. If he was coming up today, he could be another Austin because he's just as good on promos and the same caliber of worker. He just came along when real promos weren't as important as gimmick promos, and good wrestling wasn't as important as an aesthetic steroid-laden physique. Finally, Goldberg pinned Sting to keep the title in 8:07. A lot better than you'd think. Sting did his best job in a long time. Finish saw Sting get the Scorpion on after Goldberg missed the spear. Hogan ran in and kicked Sting off, and Goldberg used the spear and jackhammer. After the match, Hogan attacked Goldberg with pathetic offense, and Hart ran in, or limped in, and made the save. Latest rumors, and again, any plans in wrestling more than 48 hours from now are subject to change, and long-term plans are almost definitely not going to happen like that. But anyway, the title is scheduled to go from Goldberg to Hogan to Nash, or from Goldberg to Nash if they can cut Hogan out of the equation. Although that may all be to keep Nash happy, because a happy Nash supplies lots of good ideas. Ultimo Dragon has scheduled a press conference for September 16th in Japan, which apparently will address his future in wrestling. The doctor in the Steiner/Bagwell skits called Dr. Cecil Schwartz. Real name actually is Cecil Schwartz, but he's a backstage production grip. Thunder on September 10th in Lexington, Kentucky at Rupp Arena drew a non-sellout of 10,620, paying $198,755. The show drew a 3.38 rating and 5.60 share on the live showing, and a 1.1 rating and 4.2 share on the replay. The rating is well below usual for a Thursday Thunder, made more disappointing because it was the best Thunder since the show in Oakland in mid-July. Matches weren't good at all, but the angles were real good. Guerrero beat Silver King via DQ for a chair shot in 2:27 to keep the cruiserweight title. It appeared to be a mix-up as the bell rang and the wrestlers kept doing spots. It was supposed to set up a rematch on the pay-per-view, although nobody actually said that, because if they did do angles for the Mexicans, people might actually have an emotional involvement going into their matches. Jericho was supposed to wrestle Wrath, but he got lost and got locked out of the building. Wrath got mad that he wasn't there and went to find him to get his title shot. Segment would have been real good except for two major problems. One, someone forgot to lock the door, so when Jericho tried to open it, it actually opened and he had to close it fast and pound on it again. Second, when Wrath got there and chased Jericho, the camera stayed on for too long and you actually see Wrath not only catch Jericho but run right by him and pass him without touching him. They aired a tape of Jim Duggan's interview where he talked about having cancer and his operation. Very good interview. Kanyon was supposed to wrestle Nick Dinsmore. He told Lodi to have Saturn come out. Saturn came out and showed everyone a sign that said, "Lodi's not here." After Kanyon read the sign, Saturn suplexed him all over the place. Saturn broke Canyon's thumb. Raven told the flock to get Saturn. None of them wanted to, but finally they did, and Saturn destroyed all of them. Really good angle. McMichael beat Hennig via DQ in 3:43 when Hennig hit high with Mike. McMichael took the bump before he got hit. Bagwell was out there as well. Malenko made the save and then Anderson came out with a 2x4 to a huge pop. McMichael was carried out on a stretcher. Unfortunately, they didn't take him to wrestling school. Anderson did an interview basically saying he'd like Malenko to be a horseman. Bischoff came out and tried to boss Anderson around, although not before plugging his book. Bischoff brought up Flair's name and Anderson started choking Bischoff after Bischoff kept insulting him. After being pulled off, he challenged Anderson to an arm wrestling match, and if Anderson won, Flair could return. Bischoff said he drew the house and was mad that Anderson wrote the NWO just did what the Horsemen had done years earlier, and he said the difference was in the glory days of the Horsemen they were drawing 1,200 fans in 15,000-seat buildings for a promoter that went out of business. Bischoff and Anderson were real good here. Lodi showed up and said Saturn threw him in the river and he had a fish in his pants. Funny. Bulldog and Neidhart had a handicap match against Luger. I'm trying to figure out who was handicapped. Brett came out and suddenly attacked his family to save Luger. For the finish, Luger racked Neidhart in 4:02. Neidhart was so unbalanced on Luger's shoulders that he nearly dropped him and needed an MRI on his shoulder, and there was concern the next day that he may not be able to wrestle in War Games, but as the joke goes, he asked the doctor if he'd be able to wrestle a good match in 2 days, and the doctor said the injury wasn't that bad and there's no reason he couldn't. You know the punchline from there, especially if you saw the match. Conan beat Disco Inferno in 1:03 with the Tequila Sunrise. Pre-match byplay was great with Disco and Alex wanting to join the NWO, and when Conan didn't seem that impressed, Alex was telling Conan how cool he was. They showed a clip of Steve and Scott Armstrong being interviewed, and Miller showed up and they had to sell for his lame kicks. Norman Smiley, who was never identified, had a confrontation with Miller. Real good. Just kidding. It was awful. Even Piper did a good interview, and that's scary. Goldberg beat Rick Fuller in 1:38 with the jackhammer. They did a lot of UFC spots. Hogan and Disciple interfered and Goldberg speared Disciple. The Piper interview and Goldberg match tied the Horseman segment for the highest rating. Main Event, which did a weak rating, saw Nash beat Stevie Ray via DQ and Vincent interfered in 4:05 of a terrible match. Hall showed up acting like he was drunk and laid out Nash. Before the show started, they taped matches for September 17th. Disciple beat Scott Armstrong, Raven beat Kidman, might as well cut him off before he gets some heat, and Mike Enos beat Lenny Lane. After Goldberg's match and before and during Ray vs. Nash, the place began emptying and there was no crowd heat. They continued taping Hennig over Smiley, Guerrero over Disco. They actually were going to do an angle where Disco was 7 pounds over the weight and had to sweat off the weight to make it, but in doing so was so tired he lost easily. But since Guerrero isn't champ anymore, I guess that's scrapped. The arm wrestling deal saw Bagwell replace Bischoff, as Bischoff said everyone misunderstood his challenge, and with Anderson's bad arm, Bagwell won the arm wrestling so Flair can't come back. Miller beat Fuller and it was so dead and so many people had left that they quickly threw out the TV main of Nash and Conan over Hall and Ray via DQ when Bando interfered. They were scheduled to tape Wrath vs. Bobby Eaton, Wright vs. Scott Putski, Vincent vs. Steve Armstrong and Kaz Hayashi vs. Silver King, but didn't bother, so Thunder will be filled with tapes, interviews and packages to kill time.
Sonny Wanu is now managing Hayashi, so they've gone from step A of the angle to step E while ignoring B, C, And Hayashi and Guerrero had a real good match that aired on WCW Saturday night.
It is expected that WCW will continue to employ Duggan to make personal appearances on sale dates and work in PR. Giant is trying to leverage into a raise or a push, claiming he's got a huge offer waiting to be had from the other guys. One of the reasons for the Stevie Ray push is they want both Ray and Booker T near the top when the Bobby Walker lawsuit goes to court. Expect Rey Mysterio Jr. back in about 3 weeks. I believe La Parka is suspended for working in Mexico when he was supposedly out with a torn ACL. There was an AP story about the latest fiasco on the road on September 15 in Mobile, Alabama for WCW Saturday night tapings that drew 3,988, paying $78,925. The original booking was for a Goldberg vs. Giant dark match, which was the only match advertised. After the problems in Terre Haute and Peoria, it came out that Goldberg had also been promised mobile off, and as it turned out, Giant missed the date as well because he was taking care of his problem in Nassau. The newspaper ad, which only listed one match, also had 7 photos of wrestlers, only 2 of whom appeared. They did change some of the advertising and not list a main event, but that was after most of the tickets had been sold. In building they made no announcement, and when the show ended the crowd was furious and chanting refund. After the problems in Providence, that wasn't going to happen again. The story quoted the building manager, Jay Hagerman, as blaming WCW for the problem. Alan Sharp of WCW claimed that photos of wrestlers in a newspaper ad are listing people that could be appearing and not necessarily would be appearing. Oh boy, was that bad. Anyway, WCW in the local newspaper story said that anyone who saved their ticket stub from this show can get a free ticket to the next house show in Mobile. This also resulted in the weakest merchandise night for WCW of the year at just $4.65 per head, because at these shows where Goldberg no-shows, they sell no merchandise for anyone when people leave the building. Nitro for October 12th in Chicago sold more than 11,000 tickets for more than $301,000 the first day they were put on sale. A correction from last week regarding the September 7th Jericho vs. Neidhart match. It wasn't a finish booked on crack. Actually, Neidhart tapped out from the Lion Tamer and ref didn't see it, and Neidhart was hurting from being stretched, which is why the hold looked so bad, and then Jericho broke it. The ref didn't call it a finish, so it fell apart from there and Jericho went back to the Lion Tamer. Neidhart didn't want to tap again and Jericho told the ref to ring the bell. The ref said that he didn't tap and Jericho said it was a work and to ring the bell. It sure looked like a mess. The other house shows for the week were September 9th in Evansville, Indiana, which drew 4,143, paying $84,028, and September 11th in Cincinnati, which drew 13,338, paying $226,678. Merchandise for the week not including the pay-per-view show in Winston-Salem was $308,082 or $6.95 per head. Catching up on ratings. Nitro on September 7th going unopposed at a 5.46 rating, 4.96 first hour, 5.56 seconds hour, 5.85 third hour, and 8.4 share. The peak was a 6.2 for the Malenko-Hennig cage match and post-match deal involving Anderson. Piper and Page vs. Sting and Luger did a 6.0, Goldberg vs. Putski was 5.5, weak spot was Chris Adams vs. Stevie Ray at 5.2. The NFL game head-to-head did a 14.8, which explains why the rating fell from the previous week even though it was a better show. WCW Saturday Night on September 5th did a 2.3 rating and September 12th did a 2.0. WWF Raw on September 14th in San Jose was largely a great show before a sellout 13,161, paying $325,870. It opened with McMahon coming out with Undertaker and Kane basically saying that while he hated Undertaker, the three had come to a business agreement that they'd protect his back and he'd set one of them up for the title. He said the September 27th pay-per-view match from Hamilton could only end if one of them pinned Austin or if Austin pinned one of them. Austin came out. McMahon told him in reference to what else, that Stone Cold screwed Stone Cold and Austin decked him. Undertaker and Kane beat up on Austin with a double choke slam, putting him down very easily, and McMahon mocked him. Jeff Jarrett beat Road Dogg in 3:04 when Jarrett hit Dogg in the throat with the guitar twice. During the ringside brawl, Billy Gunn first hit Dennis Knight over the head, breaking the guitar, so Jarrett had to put down Jesse with a broken guitar. Road Dogg left in an ambulance and Gunn left with him. The Rock beat Kane in 6:09 in a match where Rocky worked as a total babyface while the rest of the nation acted too scared to come to ringside because Undertaker would be there. The crowd went nuts when Rock delivered the People's Elbow. Undertaker interfered after a ref bump which brought out Mankind, who hit Kane with a sledgehammer and Rocky pinned him. Undertaker challenged Mankind to a match and told him to bring his sledgehammer. Mankind, all bruised up in the face and still doing the Mankind gimmick. Last week the idea was for him to return as Cactus Jack, but apparently, that isn't happening just yet. Accepted. Dustin Runnels did an interview spoofing the WWF's enemies by complaining about all the dirty nasty things on the TV show. Val Venus came out and showed a video which ended up with Terry Runnels, Marlena, although she was called Terry, under the sheets. Good angle. They did a goofy vignette of Steve Regal chopping down a tree. Triple H beat Owen Hart when Chyna was beating up on Mark Henry outside the ring and Hart was distracted, allowing Triple H to hit the pedigree in 5:23 of an average bout. Henry challenged X-Pac and Chyna to a handicap match. Undertaker NC Mankind in a match where Mankind worked as the face and Taker was total heel. It wasn't as good as their usual match, but Mankind still took some brutal bumps. Undertaker delivered a choke slam and a tombstone on a chair when Rock came out of the dumpster Mankind had brought to ringside and saved Mankind. Gangrel and Edge went to a double count out in 3:26 when Edge missed a dive and went splat on the floor. Gangrel nailed him with the implant DDT. Lots of high-impact spots and both guys did a good job here. Gangrel's moves look good as a fan even though guys complain that he's too stiff. Gangrel spit blood all over Edge and made a remark like the same blood flows through both of them. Henry beat X-Pac and Chyna when he pinned Chyna after a power slam in 3:54. A lot better than it had any right to be. Sable beat Jacqueline in an evening gown ripping contest in 1:45. Jacqueline's boobs came out of her underwear after a power bomb. It was only momentarily, but luckily they aired it again on replay. It turned into something of an issue the next day to the point that in the middle of a TV day, Vince McMahon was talking to Alex Mervez trying to explain that it was all an accident. That Sable was supposed to make sure both were wearing underwear that wouldn't have their boobs fall out of on impact, and that the replay guy kept the replay going too long. David Schwartz of USA Network said it was no different than what's on broadcast TV in that time slot. Yeah, every weeknight in primetime I watch network TV and see women's boobs fall out. If you're going to do it for ratings and people watch, well, the game is shock value ratings, but I just hate when everyone is so weaselly about it after the fact. Finally, Austin no contest Shamrock in 12:17. A good solid match with a lot of heat ending when Undertaker and Kane came out. Taker choke slammed Shamrock to get him out of the picture and they went to work on Austin, but Mankind and Rock made the save and Austin hit Mankind and Taker with chairs just as the show went off the air. Before Raw started, they had 2 tryout matches, with Donovan Morgan beating Michael Modest in what we were told was a very good match, and Shoichi Funaki beat Suicide Kid, Kid's tryout. For syndication, D'Lo Brown beat Scorpio, Taka Michinoku beat Christopher Daniels in what was said to have been the best match on the entire taping. Venus beat Brian Christopher in a good match, Runnels beat Darren Drozdov in a bad match, and Maivia won a battle royal. Maivia stole the show and actually got a better pop than Austin. September 15th in Sacramento drew a sellout of about 11,500. A really drunken, unruly crowd. Modest beat Tony Jones in a match taped for the Hateen the Mat documentary, which was a good solid match with good heat. Dan Severn beat Robert Thompson with an armbar submission in a boring match. For Shotgun, Farouk and Scorpio beat Miguel Perez and Jesus Castillo when Scorpio pinned Castillo with a 450. Bradshaw destroyed Frank Murdoch with the stiffest clothesline in the history of the state of California in less than 1 minute. In the best match on the entire card, Too Much beat Suicide Kid and Christopher Daniels when Brian Christopher pinned Kid after the old Midnight Express Vegomatic, and Gangrel beat Bob Holly with the implant DDT. For Sunday Night Heat on September 20th, it was taped in Sacramento because Heat on September 27th will be live from Hamilton before the pay-per-view. Mankind beat Runnels with the claw in a dull match. Mankind was seconded for some reason by Shamrock and Rocky. After the match, Venus came out and said he wanted to play his new video but the censors wouldn't let him because it's XXX, and said if you don't know how hard the Big Valboski is, ask your wife. Dustin was crying in the ring again. Undertaker and Kane did an interview and were jumped by Mankind and someone else. Vince interviewed Mankind and told him he was ruining the master plan. Jacqueline beat Luna with a figure 4. Luna came out with oddities and fans popped for them, and even popped for Sable dancing. Sable called Jacqueline a bitch after the match and challenged her to a match on Raw. DX came out all wearing football uniforms with number 69 and in the intro Triple H called Jim Cornette a 70s style manager. D'Lo and Jarrett and Hart beat Triple H and X-Pac and Billy Gunn when Canterbury interfered and powerslammed X-Pac and Brown pinned him with a frog splash. After the match, Henry jumped Triple H in the aisle and left him laying after a leg drop and Triple H was carried out. Edge beat Taka in a bout not as good as you'd think because it was one-sided using the downward spiral. Kaientai then attacked Edge until Gangrel made the save for him and the two had a stare down. Slaughter called out Snow, who came out in handcuffs. It wound up with Slaughter challenging him to a boot camp match on Raw, and if Sarge won, Snow would have to leave the WWF, don't ask, and if he won, he could return. Hey, at least they're trying to give a logical explanation for not living up to their stips. I'm still wondering why Vader's still got the mask on. Undertaker and Kane beat DOA when Kane tombstoned one of them. Bad match. Vince came out with Taker and Kane. For Raw that airs on September 21st, Billy Gunn beat Jarrett when Jarrett tried to use the guitar. The ref stopped him, and Gunn using a neck breaker on him for the pin. Boring. McMahon came out to open the show with Mankind, Rock, and Shamrock. He said he was ready to give all three a golden opportunity of a lifetime. Austin came out and he said Austin would have to wrestle Taker and Kane in a tag match later in the show and he could pick any partner except Mankind, Rock and Shamrock would blow their opportunity to get a title match on September 28th if they accepted. McMahon then announced a triple threat match with those three with the winner getting a shot at the champion on September 28th in Detroit. Bangers came out with Golga, Silva, and Kurgan. All were dancing in the ring until Bangers jumped the oddities and ripped up Golga's doll. Golga was crying. Nobody cared at all. Segment died. Austin came out. Actually, a fan who looked like Austin hit the ring and security mugged him. Austin did an interview saying nobody in the dressing room would be his partner because they were all afraid of pissing McMahon off. He was swearing like crazy since it's the edited show. DOA beat Justice via DQ when Jarrett KO'd Ellering with the guitar and the match simply ended. Snow beat Slaughter in the boot camp match, which had a lot of heat. Snow was more over than he was in ECW. Snow hit Slaughter with the head and pinned him. Gerald Briscoe and Patterson hit the ring and attacked Snow until Scorpio made the save. Venus beat Hart via DQ when Runnels attacked Venus. Venus made his own comeback and tied Runnels in the ropes and slapped him around and asked him if he ever saw Marlena have an orgasm. He showed another video and was crying in the ring. X-Pac beat D-Lo to win the European title in a good match when he caught D-Lo coming off the top with a facebuster. Jacqueline beat Sable in a short not good match when Mero interfered, tripping Sable after Sable had knocked Mero off the apron. Billy Gunn turned out to be Austin's partner against Undertaker and Kane in an average match but with good heat due to Austin, ending when Taker chokeslammed Gunn. After the match, Austin hit both Undertaker and Kane with a chair. Since it was around 11:40 p.m., the crowd emptied out big time at this point, not staying for the triple threat match, so they had very little heat early. It picked up for those who stayed when Rock did the elbow. Rock was over more as a face than the other two, which is saying something since Shamrock is billed as being from Sacramento. Taker and Kane came out with McMahon and they basically beat up all three, leaving Rock laying with a choke slam. Austin ran in and punched McMahon and ran to the back. The match simply ended without an ending and the fans booed that fact, and the show ended on a bad note. Univision held a press conference on September 15th to announce its fall season lineup and pushed Super Astros Del Ring as starting in a few weeks. They claimed in the press kit they were going to introduce a new wrestler called Mariachi as a star of the show, but he wasn't there. But they did have Savio Vega and Armando Fernandez, formerly Tarzan Boy, at a press conference. October 25th in Madison Square Garden has Taker and Kane vs. Austin and Mankind, Outlaws and X-Pac vs. Southern Justice and Jarrett, Triple H vs. Rock for the IC belt, Mero and Jacqueline vs. Venus and Sable, Gangrel vs. Edge, D-Lo vs. Farouk, Animal and Drozda vs. DOA and Vader vs. Bart Gunn. Bart Gunn suffered an elbow injury from the force on the elbow of jarring so many heads. Vader is out of action due to elevated blood pressure, which according to his doctor was from a potassium and electrolyte imbalance caused by overdieting and overtraining and dropping so much weight so quickly. While obviously the intentions are good in wanting everyone down to a good weight for them, attempting to get guys to drastically change their weight and putting pressure on it to happen yesterday does lead to extreme diets which are never good for anyone. Timing of this wasn't good for Vader either, as he's back in the doghouse with some in the office and he's had his detractors in the office for a long time. Mark Canterbury missed the weekend house shows since he wasn't allowed to fly for medical reasons but was allowed to fly into San Jose for TV. Business is incredible at the house shows. September 11th in Calgary drew the biggest crowd in the history of pro wrestling in that city of 14,017, paying $351,785. The old record crowd was for a 1987 show headlined by Hogan vs. King Kong Bundy, which drew 12,034, and the gate record was set last year of $229,598 at the Calgary Stampede pay-per-view show. September 12th in Seattle drew a sellout 15,076 paying $302,785 at the Key Arena, which are both all-time records in that market. September 13th in Anaheim drew 10,252 paying $256,980. Austin won 4 ways over Mankind, Undertaker and Kane in the main events with Slaughter as ref. Slaughter wouldn't count, so Austin threw him out of the ring and a second ref counted the falls. McMahon appeared and did a heel promo in Anaheim. Since it was his hometown, he switched the normal finish and allowed Hart to beat Shamrock in Calgary. Merchandise for the week was $391,258 American, converting the Calgary merchandise to American dollars, or $7.46 per head. Manager Wally Yamaguchi suffered a torn bicep and messed up shoulder doing a spot at SummerSlam. Meadowlands on October 4th as the same 4-way for the title, Mero and Jacqueline vs. Venus and Sable, Rock and D-Lo vs. Triple H and X-Pac and Outlaws defending against Southern Justice. Rumors have Fox Network leaning toward doing something with WWF, but no done deal. The September 18th issue of Sports Collector's Digest has a story on former Cincinnati Bengal Ross Browner written by WCW writer Ross Foreman and includes a comment on Brian Pillman. Browner stated, "One person I'll never forget from Cincinnati was Brian Pillman. When Brian first arrived in training camp, I still remember thinking, man, he is so small. But, after watching this guy, the way he went after the sport, he was like a wild man, a total hitman. Brian was a special teams ace. He was so fast, so quick. He always got the job done. I remember, there were so many times as we prepared for games when Brian would be hitting lockers to get psyched up, and I'd always think to myself, Brian, don't hurt yourself. But that was his motivation." Catching up on ratings, on September 5th, WWF Live Wire did a 1.6 and the special 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. version of Raw did a 2.6 rating and 6.9 share, which is a good number for the slot. On September 6th, Superstars did a 2.1 and somehow the number of Sunday Night Heat disappeared from all ratings listings, as if the show somehow never existed. For September 12th, Livewire did a 1.6, the 7 to 9 p.m. version of Raw did a 2.6 rating and 5.0 share, which really isn't nearly so impressive, and for September 13th, Superstars did a 2.0 and Sunday Night Heat did a 3.1 rating and 5.3 share, and it proved to be no boost at all for the rest of the USA Sunday Night lineup. On the Heat show, which went head-to-head with the WCW pay-per-view show, the show ended before Austin gave McMahon and the Musketeers all 2 sets of stunners and gave Shane McMahon the stunner. The Reader's Pages. Hall of Fame. I've been intrigued with the Hall of Fame issues of The Observer. Regarding the recent voting, I feel there were a few surprises. I was shocked Mick Foley didn't make it. In my mind, he's the most deserving wrestler that was in the balloting this year. I'm sure he'll make it next year. I thought Jimmy Snuka would make it without a doubt. I'm sure he'll make it next year as well. I was wavering on Undertaker. He's always been at the top and helped the WWF brave the lull in the business from 1991 to 1995. He's a big man, but unlike many big wrestlers, he's capable of having great matches if he's paired with a good worker. For some reason I don't think Sting should make it. It doesn't help that he's largely been stagnant in 1998. Regarding Bill Wolkowitz's letter in the September 14th issue, there were many things I disagreed with. ECW has done 6 pay-per-view shows. Of the 6, 2 were great, barely legal, and Heatwave 98. Others had good wrestling but weren't good television productions, Hardcore Heaven 97 and November to Remember 97, and 2 were good television productions but the wrestling wasn't up to par, Living Dangerously and WrestlePalooza 98. After seeing Heatwave, I think it's obvious ECW can put on a good pay-per-view show. What differentiates ECW from WCW is the effort put out by the workers, and the storylines and angles are a lot clearer. I've yet to see an ECW show, whether live or on pay-per-view, where I didn't feel the wrestlers busted their asses to put on a good show. On the other hand, when you order a WCW pay-per-view event, you can see basketball players and talk show hosts in the main event along with a guy who even in his prime could never work his way out of a paper bag. When you consider some of the recent offerings on pay-per-view, has ECW really done so bad? WCW's Road Wild set a new standard for horrible. Why anyone would care about half the matches is beyond me. Bash at the Beach had a few decent matches but was subpar overall. I was at the Great American Bash live and was bored to tears at times, wondering why we had to see Roddy Piper wrestle twice. I resent the remark that Paul Heyman should shut down ECW and open up an actual wrestling company. Some of the best shows I've ever seen were in the ECW arena. There have been many great matches, ranging from all-out brawls to technical masterpieces. The crowd heat is amazing, even if much of it is negative. The ECW atmosphere is unique to a WWF or WCW crowd, because most of the workers want to have a good match, even if it's only in front of 200 fans. This is in contrast to much of what is seen in the Big Two. I'd hate to consider what the state of pro wrestling today would be had ECW never come along. Look at what WWF and WCW were doing in 1994. While WCW was suing Dave Sullivan and the Zodiac Butcherman with no name in high spots, and the WWF was building around Yokozuna and Lex Luger, ECW was introducing new stars to the US like Chris Benoit and Dean Malenko and creating Tommy Dreamer and Sandman. Wrestlers like Shane Douglas and Public Enemy totally changed the way interviews and promos were done, shooting them on location and talking about different things. ECW has had so many angles copied by WCW to the point it's ridiculous. Both WWF and WCW have been heavily influenced by ECW. Saying ECW isn't an actual wrestling company is totally absurd. Just because ECW doesn't play to as large an audience is irrelevant. ECW has never said it was like WWF or WCW, hence their expression, experience the difference. Relatively new stars like Justin Credible, Masato Tanaka and Jerry Lynn assure me that Paul Heyman is constantly making an effort to improve the athletic content of his product. Matt Griffin. Quantico, Virginia,